A savage wind tears across the frozen wasteland, whipping snow through the darkness, while the only sounds left alive are the sharp groans of splitting ice and the terrifying primal roars rolling out from somewhere deep in the shadows. In the middle of that frozen slaughter, where monstrous bodies lie scattered and motionless across the ice, a single ornate sword remains planted upright in the ground, standing like a silent witness to a brutal battle that has only just ended. Far above the white emptiness, a lone bird cuts through the freezing sky, its pale wings steady against the bitter wind, as its sharp eyes sweep over the vast, lifeless expanse below. Across the endless sheet of snow, one solitary figure presses forward step by step, his body leaning into the cold as each determined stride carves a fresh trail behind him. Adrian Leonberg, the first prince once known as the magic sword Gruhorn, stares straight ahead without the slightest wavering, his face hardened by everything this merciless world has forced him to endure. Wrapped in his distinctive armor, the young prince carries himself with a calm but unmistakable strength, as if every inch of him is already prepared for whatever nightmare the frozen wastes might throw at him next. Then, without warning, a monstrous roar tears through the freezing air. From the shadows, a hulking red-skinned beast bursts forward, its glowing eyes fixed on him, and its massive body charging like a wall of death. Adrian does not step back. In an instant, he launches himself into battle, his sword flashing upward, in a deadly arc to meet the creature head-on. A blade soaked in dark blood gleams against the cold reflection of the wasteland, and just from the stains along its edge, the violence of the fight that had unfolded there moments ago becomes impossible to ignore. At the same time, a chaotic pulse of energy stirs within the darkness, flickering like something alive as it twists and gathers in the shadows. For countless ages, a terrifying red monster with a single glowing eye had snarled from the depths of this world, standing as a reminder of the ancient horrors that never truly disappeared. Again and again, calamities descended, yet Adrian Leonberg, clad in shining armor, was always the one who threw himself into the heart of the chaos. War after war raged without end, and Adrian fought through them with ruthless precision, his sword sweeping through the darkness like a storm. From the ruin left behind, countless heroes rose, while Adrian Leonberg himself burned like a beacon of power, his entire body wrapped in a fierce blue aura. But no matter how many battles were won, the hideous face of evil always returned, taking shape once more as a green-skinned beast with blazing red eyes that refused to stay buried. Evil had sunk itself into the very foundation of this world, yet the prince stood ready before it, his resolve unshaken and his spirit sharpened for the fight ahead. Across that broken world, he surged through ruined lands and desolate fields, leaping straight into the path of the spreading darkness as if battle itself had become his eternal fate. At the center of it all, he stood before a blade blazing with golden light, its brilliance reflecting back on him like a mirror of the legendary existence he had carried through endless war. Because before he stood in this human body, he had been the magic sword Gruhorn, a living legend tempered in the furnace of countless brutal wars. Now, the snow-swept wasteland stretched endlessly around him, cold and silent, bearing the scars of conflict that never seemed to end. Among the frozen corpses of his enemies, the prince stood alone, an imposing figure against a merciless white horizon. A low, quiet sound slipped from him as he extended his hand, not in triumph, but in grim recognition of the chaos and bloodshed surrounding him. His eyes moved slowly across the vast, silent battlefield, until they reached the distant fortress standing beyond the snow, cold and unmoving like a witness to his never-ending struggle. But the battle had not ended. From beyond the frozen haze, new monstrous shapes surged forward, their numbers swelling one after another as they rushed in, hungry for the next strike. With a brutal impact that seemed to shake bone and armor alike, Adrian drove a devastating blow into his enemy, his armored form blurring with raw, concentrated force. The creature folded beneath the crushing power of the strike, its grotesque body giving way as blood and viscera burst violently across the snow. From within a blood-red vortex, more grotesque monsters began to take form, their crimson eyes burning with hatred as every one of them locked onto the same target. Then even more of those twisted abominations poured out, rising like an unstoppable tide of terror. But Gruhorn did not bend, and he did not break. His will stayed firm, his focus sharpened like steel, as the thought rang through him with absolute certainty. He was not merely a sword. Then electric blue light erupted around him, and he shot forward with lethal speed, his blade cutting through the air like a streak of lightning. His eyes burned with fierce resolve, and as the sword in his hands flared with an intense azure glow, his vow became clear. As a knight, he would stand there. With one devastating sweep, Adrian unleashed a massive arc of blue power that tore across the battlefield. The force crashed outward like a catastrophe, ripping through everything in its path and shattering the frozen ground beneath it. His eye blazed with electric blue intensity, fierce and unyielding, reflecting the sheer strength of a will that refused to be broken. He stood over snow-covered mountains and frozen valleys, like a lone force of nature, dominating the bleak landscape around him. Nearby, ancient walls stained by blood remained silent in the cold, towering like monuments to carnage long past. Blue energy ignited around his body, fierce and powerful, spilling from him in waves that made his unstoppable determination impossible to miss. Adrian looked over the devastation with steady eyes, his expression unreadable but focused, already prepared for whatever challenge would rise from the ruins next. Then, in the middle of that freezing stillness, a single war horn blasted through the air, its deep cry echoing across the snow as the signal for a relentless dawn charge. A new face emerged from the cold, a battle-hardened man with dark hair and a wicked scar, his expression carved with absolute resolve. And he was not standing alone. A formidable squad had gathered with him, including the scarred warrior and a striking woman with long white hair, every one of them armed and ready for war. Another powerful figure stepped into view, a woman with long, wavy brown hair, her body crackling with intense blue energy as determination burned clearly in her eyes. Then a charismatic knight with golden hair joined the fray, his bright blue eyes filled with confidence as his own powerful glow radiated around him. A chilling burst of blue light erupted across the battlefield, washing over the wide blanket of snow, and turning the frozen world into something eerie and almost otherworldly. Adrian Leonberg stood unyielding among a sea of fallen warriors, his iconic red cape cutting sharply against his gleaming plate armor, while his massive greatsword pierced the frozen ground before him. Around the silent, defeated forms, that same electric blue energy still crackled faintly, lingering like the ghost of a brutal war the world had nearly forgotten. Even so, Adrian remained standing like a living beacon of resolve, his eyes burning with a determination that no amount of death or ruin could shake. The frozen ground had become a graveyard of blades, with swords thrust into the ice like markers for ancient heroes whose names had been lost to time. One battle-worn hilt remained clutched in an armored hand, a silent relic of struggles no one could fully remember. Then Adrian Leonberg appeared with the faintest confident smirk on his lips, his cross-shaped sword blazing with intense golden light. The snow-swept wasteland stretched on in endless silence, standing like a cold monument to epic battles long forgotten. That silence shattered when a grotesque green-skinned monster exploded into view, red energy burning in its eyes and sharp fangs bared as it roared with primal fury. Adrian Leonberg moved without hesitation, bursting forward as his radiant cross-shaped sword sliced through the air toward the grotesque monster. A brutal metallic shing rang out as the blade struck its mark, tearing through flesh and sending a torrent of gore spilling into the cold. The beast reeled from the impact, blood bursting from the wound, but Adrian was already in motion again, moving like a blur filled with deadly purpose. A surge of raw emotion crashed through him, and he slammed his fist into the ground with such force that the ice cracked beneath him. In that silent burst of memory and pain, one truth tore through his heart: all of them had been his friends. But grief was something he could not afford to hold on to in the middle of battle. Adrian surged forward again, wrapped in steel and blue energy, his sword burning like a comet as it came down toward the next monster. A deafening clang split the air as his blade struck true again and again. Adrian tore through the monster horde with furious precision, every slash carrying the crushing weight of his past, while the memory of myths reduced to ash screamed inside him as though they had been erased from him completely. A sickening thump followed as another monster collapsed, its body hitting the frozen ground while its eyes stayed wide open, locked in one final stunned stare. And then, for one brief moment, silence returned. Adrian stood victorious with his glowing sword still radiating raw power, the only figure left standing amid the field of defeated monsters, before he unleashed one more swift and devastating strike. Surrounded by the fallen, Adrian remained upright in victory, his posture firm and his gaze locked straight ahead, as if the next enemy was already in his sights. A flicker of grim resolve sharpened in his eye, small but unmistakable, like the final spark before another storm of battle. Then a bone-rattling growl ripped across the desolate landscape, shaking the cold air itself. In this age of tribulation that had finally arrived, a colossal, monstrous foe burst forth from the wasteland, towering over everything before it, and Adrian stood his ground without retreating even a single step. The monstrous creature throws its head back and releases a deafening, guttural roar, the sound tearing across the frozen wasteland like the howl of something born only to destroy. But Adrian's eyes do not waver. Instead, they flare to life with an intense electric blue glow, crackling with power as if lightning itself has been trapped behind his gaze. In the next instant, a vivid blue aura bursts out around him, surging violently from his body in waves of raw energy that ripple through the cold air. His cross-shaped sword answers that power, pulsing with the same unleashed force as if it has awakened alongside him. Then Adrian crashes down onto the frozen battlefield, his crimson cape whipping around his shining armor, standing like an unbreakable beacon of resolve in the middle of all that carnage. Yet another horror rises before him, its jagged face twisted with hatred and its burning red eyes glaring through the storm, a nightmare given flesh and sharpened by pure malice. Even then, the prince does not retreat. Bathed in explosive radiance, Adrian stands firm against the growing darkness, his very presence roaring back in defiance without him needing to say a word. Once I existed as nothing more than an ethereal mass of pure energy, drifting beyond flesh and form, until that shapeless existence was given new life. My essence gathered, condensed, and took shape. And from that strange rebirth, I was reincarnated not as a man, but as a sword. Over the course of hundreds of long years, countless hands took hold of me, and one master after another carried me into battle. I lent them my strength on blood-soaked fields, my edge carving through enemy after enemy as their struggles became part of my own existence. With my power at their side, I helped shape them into legends, heroes whose names would be remembered across history. And then, after what felt like an eternity of wandering from hand to hand, I finally met my comrade. Adrian Leonberg, the first prince, stood before me with the bearing of royalty and the unshakable presence of someone who refused to bow before fate. But even a comrade like him could not keep every danger away, because a new and terrifying threat had already begun to gather in the distance. Long before that, though, when I first found him, he was only a child from a forgotten village. Together, we fought the monsters that threatened his home, the village of Leonberg, and many other places beyond it. With every snarling beast we cut down, his resolve grew harder, sharper, and more impossible to break. Before long, we were crossing the world together, a terrifying pair on the battlefield, standing against every darkness that dared to block our path. His road was built on endless hardship and courage that never faltered. Step by step, battle by battle, he accomplished things no one else could reach until his name rose above ordinary men and became legend itself. But even legends are not spared from new trials. Somewhere beyond the desolate snow-covered peaks, an immense shadow began to stir like a great dragon waking from an ancient sleep. And with it, a new threat emerged. The glowing blade, now wrapped in dark, swirling energy, waited for the next hand worthy of wielding it. Then Adrian Leonberg was struck completely off guard. A massive crimson explosion erupted around him, tearing through the air, and before he could even blink, a razor-sharp white claw flashed through the chaos and landed a devastating blow. The force of the attack hurled him backward, forcing a choked cough from his throat as blood splashed across his cheek. But even battered and thrown off balance, Adrian was not finished. By instinct alone, he raised one hand, blue energy flaring desperately in front of him to meet the unseen enemy and keep himself alive. But that desperate defense could not hold. The relentless assault smashed through his guard and drove him down to his knees, his once proud armor torn and battered as debris whipped around him like a blizzard. Blow after blow rained down, cracking the ground apart and scattering shards in every direction. The blinding white energy kept raging across the battlefield, carving ruin into everything it touched. Then, from the very center of the storm, the true nightmare finally showed itself, a monstrous shadowy dragon beast, its eyes burning with infernal blood-red light. Its enormous jaws split open, and a hellish red glow blazed deep within its throat, before it unleashed a soul-shaking roar that rolled across the frozen wasteland. Adrian braced himself as the colossal dark entity lashed out with shadowy tendrils and raw power, each strike slamming into him with brutal force. Still, even under that crushing onslaught, he found a chance to strike back, swinging his blade in a desperate counterattack fueled by fierce determination. But the monstrous enemy answered with a devastating burst of crimson energy, swallowing Adrian whole inside a blinding explosion. That overwhelming magical power washed over the landscape like a wave of pure destruction, threatening to bury everything beneath it. But from within that raging darkness, a brilliant blue light suddenly erupted, forcing its way outward with incredible strength. Adrian pressed the assault without stopping, his sword becoming a blur as he unleashed strike after strike in a relentless barrage. Then he poured everything into one final overwhelming wave of azure energy, sending the colossal entity reeling backward. Defeated for the moment, as the dust began to settle, a new voice rang out through the ruined battlefield. A man with a confident smile stepped forward and offered his aid, calling to him. "Let's go, my friend." And with those words, a new ally had arrived. The blue energy slowly faded, leaving behind shattered earth, broken ice, and the lingering cold of a battle that had shaken the field to its core. Then the very air split apart with a deafening crack. Adrian Leonberg unleashed his power again, his face twisted with a primal roar of determination as the force inside him burst free. The monstrous dark entity roared in pain, staggering back as Adrian's blue energy slammed directly into it. A cataclysmic burst of azure light and flying ice shards detonated across the battlefield, swallowing everything in its violent radiance. Through the smoke and flying debris, Adrian emerged once more, unyielding, his sword blazing like a beacon of crackling blue power. The force of his strike had carved deep, jagged fissures into the creature's seemingly impenetrable scales. At last, the monstrous creature glared down at him, its eyes burning with ominous blood-red fury. But Adrian's glowing blade had already found its mark, buried deep in the entity's leg in a blow that struck far more deeply than the beast expected. Then an ancient memory surged back, and the power of a forgotten era burst into view. Back in the days when legends were still being forged, we had crushed impossible enemies together. Especially when we brought down the White Dragon of the Frost Mountains. After that legendary victory, my comrade rose even higher, gaining glory beyond the battlefield until he became the ruler of an entire kingdom and claimed the crown as his own. As for me, my path remained tied to this legendary blade, the symbol of our victory. Within that sword lived the legend of the Dragon Slayer, the proof of everything we had achieved together. That blade carried one unforgettable name, Gruhorn, and with the solemn plea to protect his descendants, I was passed down through the bloodline of my comrade's family. A piercing metallic shriek suddenly ripped through the air, sharp enough to make the entire space tremble, as if something extraordinary was about to awaken. A voice grumbled at the overwhelming surge of power, demanding to know why it had become so loud, while the legendary Gruhorn ignited with a blinding, otherworldly radiance. The glow exploded outward, so bright and overwhelming that the annoyed voice snapped at it for being distracting. At the same time, a furious booming voice thundered through the chaos, demanding to know who dared place a hand on such a sacred artifact. Then the young wielder answered with a declaration that shook the room itself, shouting that from that moment onward, he was the one and only master of the sword. A furious bearded official, stunned by such outrageous defiance, roared in disbelief as he recognized the youth before him as none other than His Highness. The official's voice boomed with authority as he declared that the sword was a sacred relic, something only the king himself was permitted to touch, and he demanded that it be returned at once without excuse or delay. The legendary blade Gruhorn pulsed with untamed power, its golden hilt gleaming and its razor-sharp edge trembling as though the sword itself was screaming with awakened energy. But the young prince only tightened his grip on Gruhorn, holding it with iron stubbornness as he sneered at the official. He spat out an insult, calling him a pig, then cut him off with a thunderous command to shut up. With an arrogant smirk spreading across his face, Adrian declared that there was nothing in this world he was forbidden to touch, leaving the official frozen in shock and reeling under the sheer audacity of the young royal's words. Adrian then pushed his power forward, as if testing the weight of his own authority. In response, the legendary blade pulsed fiercely, and the force within it revealed its true nature, authority and judgment. That power belonged to Adrian Leonberg, a level 999 monarch whose presence overflowed with kingly arrogance, overwhelming might, merciless resolve, fearless confidence, no trace of empathy, and an almost boundless sensitivity to mana. The moment the name Leonberg appeared, the voice recognized him as the true descendant meant to inherit the sword, though even then, a faint shadow of doubt still refused to disappear. The white-haired warrior tightened his grip around his own blade, unable to believe that this reckless prince had inherited the power of the sword's saint. In his frustration, he wished desperately that he could simply ignore the royal decree. But his irritation only grew hotter, because no matter how much he disliked the situation, he knew he could not simply turn his back on the emperor's command. Adrian's thoughts sliced cleanly through the noise around him, dismissing the man as ridiculous, as if all that shouting was nothing more than meaningless babble. Then, with his resolve boiling over, the white-haired warrior cried out to his own blade, begging the great dragon slayer to lend him its strength. His plea erupted into a furious shout, as he demanded to know whether Adrian had truly lost his mind. The white-haired warrior's rage finally burst loose, his voice booming like thunder as he snarled that a god like him would never lend his power to some arrogant brat. He roared as though the entire realm belonged beneath his feet, and then his fury sharpened into one desperate, furious cry that ripped through the air. Gruhorn! The raw force of that outburst blasted outward in heavy shockwaves, rattling the guards around him until they could only scream in panic. Terrified that everything was about to collapse into disaster, they begged their highness to calm down before the situation went completely out of control. But the warrior had already gone past the point of listening. His eyes burned with an almost unholy fire as he snapped back at them, roaring for them to shut up and demanding how they dared try to give him orders. Adrian, however, did not look shaken in the slightest. A cold, fearless smirk curved across his face as he threw out a chilling challenge, asking if the warrior truly wanted to begin, daring him to show whatever power he had left. Before the white-haired warrior could even react, Adrian vanished from where he stood, turning into a golden flash of impossible speed and lethal steel. A brutal impact crashed into the warrior before he could make sense of what had happened, knocking the breath from him and leaving only a stunned, disbelieving sound caught in his throat. Adrian's blade had already struck true. The cut was clean, precise, and devastating, slicing deep across the warrior's hand, and in that single merciless instant, the proud man was forced down to his knees, humbled before the calm prince standing above him. In the silence that followed Adrian's overwhelming strike, an attendant's face twisted with pure terror. Her hands flew up to cover her mouth, barely holding back the scream rising in her chest. A raw gasp broke out of her anyway, quickly turning into a frantic cry for His Highness. The white-haired warrior lay sprawled across the cold ground, completely shattered, with a gruesome crimson stain spreading across his chest where Adrian's attack had landed. The attendant dropped to her knees and screamed for someone to call the royal physician immediately. But through the haze of pain, the warrior could barely form a thought, only a stunned disbelief settling over him as he realized that he was the one who had been pierced by the sword. His mind spun wildly, and one furious question burned brighter than the pain itself. How could a scoundrel like this have possibly wielded such a blade? Then the world around him began to tilt and blur, the shapes in front of his eyes melting into a dizzy, disorienting haze. Cold realization struck him at once. If this continued, he was going to collapse. And for a swordsman who had lived by his blade, the shame of fainting for the first time in his life almost felt worse than the wound itself. The entire kingdom had long been tense over a chilling belief: if Prince Adrian ever ascended the throne, ruin would fall on everyone. To the public, he was known as a talentless royal, but his greed had become the stuff of ugly legend. In people's eyes, he was the perfect example of a foolish, lazy, cruel pig of a prince. That was the reputation of first Prince Adrian Leonberg. So foul that even the most infamous villains seemed almost reasonable beside him. The kingdom's future seemed to hang by a thread, like prey trapped beneath a circling hawk. Ever since the prince's birth, terrifying rumors had spread like wildfire, whispering that the arrival of a strange demon had marked his existence. In the shadows, two figures whispered among themselves. One hesitated and asked whether Adrian Leonberg was supposed to be the second prince now, only for the other to scoff and say that he had already been pushed down to third prince. Another voice cut in, confused, asking why that had happened when Adrian had not even done anything this time. But someone else brushed the concern aside, saying there was no need to worry because he would surely return to his old ways soon enough. But the strangest part was that Prince Adrian himself could not have cared less about any of those rumors. He simply stared downward, weighed down by a heavy thought that began with the bitter realization that he, of all beings, had ended up here. The truth, or perhaps the curse, screamed inside his skull. He had killed the descendant of his own comrade and stolen that person's body. Inside the luxurious royal chambers, a guard captain lowered himself to one knee before the king. His voice carried open concern as he asked whether His Majesty had already heard the latest whispers spreading through the palace. Then he revealed the shocking news. First Prince Adrian Leonberg, who had barely been seen for months, had suddenly been struck with a demotion and reduced to the position of third prince. Nearby, a royal maid wearing a smile that never quite reached her eyes sharply warned a masked guard to be careful with his words. Back upon the throne, the king watched everything with a sly glint in his eyes, remarking that Adrian had supposedly returned from the brink, and yet it seemed his infamous reputation had not changed at all. With a cold flick of dismissal, he waved the maid away and told her she could leave, since she was clearly useless to him anyway. Then the king's expression sharpened into a sneer as he demanded to know what kind of pig Adrian was supposed to be. The captain, visibly nervous, tried to explain something about a strange demon, though it was obvious he was pretending to understand more than he actually did. Once Adrian Leonberg was finally left alone, he stared ahead in blank confusion, quietly wondering whether that man was truly supposed to be his teacher. He heard someone call him Your Highness, but his mind felt almost completely empty, as if every memory had been wiped away, or perhaps not entirely. With his eyes lowered in thought, he hesitated, wondering if he had been wrong to assume enough time had already passed. Then a guard suddenly shouted that the king had arrived. Adrian's eyes snapped open at once, and the word king rang through his thoughts, as he wondered whether His Majesty had known the truth all along. A quiet sound escaped him as realization struck, and he found himself admitting that the king might be even sharper than he had first believed. His thoughts raced on, because he had genuinely believed that enough time had gone by for the rumors surrounding his bloodline to fade into nothing more than forgotten whispers. But with the king standing right there before him, that hope was crushed immediately. The rumors had not disappeared at all. The king's eyes drilled into Adrian as he coldly asked whether he could not even greet his own father, adding that even a brush with death had failed to change him. Later, after Adrian was confined to his bed, the captain of the royal guard stepped forward with worry written across his face and told His Majesty that he was concerned about Adrian's memory. The king's eyes narrowed at once as he repeated the words, "Memory loss." The captain urgently ordered that the royal physician be brought in immediately to examine His Highness. Adrian remained motionless and unresponsive on the bed, while his father and the guards watched over him, his uncertain future hanging heavily in the room. Adrian found himself facing the king, his own father, who pressed him again and again about his missing memories, asking whether he truly remembered nothing at all. Inside, Adrian's thoughts moved frantically. A cold dread tightened around him as he struggled to deal with the gaps in his memory, desperately hoping the king had not realized just how serious the problem truly was. The king's stare cut into him like a blade, his voice soaked in disappointment as he pressed the matter further. If Adrian could not even recall the things he had done, then perhaps those actions had never held any meaning to him in the first place. Adrian's expression twisted under the weight of that brutal honesty, his face tightening as if the words had struck harder than any physical blow. The king did not stop there. He continued by laying out the harsh truth that admitting one's mistakes and learning from them was what allowed a person to grow, yet Adrian had now been cut off from even that path. His voice hardened like steel as he delivered the cruelest point of all. Adrian had forgotten everything. The king's regal chains glinted in the light, a cold and silent reminder of the absolute power behind every word he spoke. With one final crushing declaration, the king made it clear that Adrian's past was gone, and because of that, he had no choice left but to move forward from the broken present he still had. Adrian Leonberg knelt before the king's icy gaze, humiliation burning through him as his mind screamed in frustration, desperate to escape the suffocating weight of that moment. Then the king's words struck like a hammer, telling him to forget the dignity of being the first prince, and that he should be grateful he was still being treated as a human being at all. Adrian's face contorted into a furious, bewildered snarl, his thoughts roaring in disbelief as he wondered what in the world the original owner of this body had been doing. The shock hit him so hard that he could barely steady his thoughts, leaving him reeling under the sheer brutality of the king's judgment. The king's voice cut through the present, overlapping with a fleeting memory of a younger Adrian held in his father's arms, as he declared that he had heard everything and told Adrian to simply accept it, asking if his memories would return soon. Another painful image flashed through his mind, a young Adrian sitting on his father's lap. But the king's words in the present were merciless, dismissing that trivial past as something that hardly mattered, while his gaze seemed to linger on what remained of his son's once beautiful face. Adrian's expression twisted in pure agony as those cruel words burned into him. The king spoke as though his poor son had wasted away into this miserable state, leaving Adrian to wonder bitterly where exactly that loss had even happened. The king of Leonberg smiled with unsettling calm, declaring that he was pleased Adrian had finally opened his eyes, though the words carried a cold weight that made them feel far from simple relief. But that supposed joy faded almost immediately, as the king gave him a chilling warning. Adrian was never to touch such dangerous objects again. His words sank even deeper as he quietly wondered what might have happened if something had gone wrong, and Adrian had never awakened at all. Adrian remained caught in his father's embrace, but there was nothing warm or comforting about it. Under the king's unyielding stare, his face sank into despair, as if the weight of that gaze alone was crushing the breath out of him. Inside his mind, Adrian screamed against everything happening to him, desperate to forget the truth, pressing down on his soul. But the cold thought kept echoing back again and again. He was already dead. Outside, the great castle loomed beneath the pale moon, its towers cutting into the cold night sky like a silent reminder of the impossible burden now resting on Adrian's shoulders. At last, the king gave him a final icy dismissal, saying he would return later, and telling Adrian to rest well as though nothing had happened at all. In response, only a low, pained sound slipped from Adrian's throat. Then that quiet sound broke into a single shattered gasp, his expression twisting with utter hopelessness as the despair he had been holding back finally surfaced. Adrian's thoughts drifted back to his past existence, to a time when even after cutting down one of his own, others still expected him to clean up the messes left behind. But deep down, he understood the truth clearly. The real problem had not been them. He was the one who had ruined his own life. Yet that despair did not last forever. A fierce resolve began to burn inside him, and with it came the determination to take back everything he had lost, starting with the memories buried somewhere beyond his reach. Now he had been reborn into a heavy, talentless body, forced once again to clean up after others, even after he had already defeated those who stood in his way. A fat body, no talent, and endless trouble waiting for him, but none of that was enough to make him stop. He clenched his fist tightly, feeling a burning need to rebuild his strength surge through him. Then, in the middle of that determination, a strange question crossed his mind. Just how many children had his old comrade even left behind? Then a name flickered briefly through his thoughts, uncertain and distant, like a fragment of memory trying to surface. Rezu. But whatever questions remained, his path was now perfectly clear. Before anything else, Adrian needed to forge a mana heart. With sharp determination burning in his eyes, Adrian began drawing in the raw energy around him, gathering the first spark of power that would mark the beginning of his return. He threw himself into harsh training, raising his hand as blue energy ignited across his palm, pulling mana inward until it began spinning into a condensed orb of light. The electric blue glow surged brighter, circling around his hand in restless waves as the mana twisted and gathered above his palm. The strain immediately pushed his body toward its limit. His eyes burned with a painful blue light as the unstable power fought against his control, and with a sharp gasp, the mana burst outward. Frustration surged through him as the scattered mana slipped away, proving that his current body was still far too weak to contain such violent power. Even so, Adrian refused to stop. His resolve hardened, And with the stubborn decision to try again, a vivid blue aura erupted around him like fire in the cold air. His eyes blazed with fierce determination as the mana surged even more violently, exploding around him while he forced himself past the limits of his fragile body. Gritting his teeth, Adrian forced his body to obey again and again, refusing to yield no matter how badly it resisted. At last, the blue energy began to gather properly, forming a massive, stable shape around both of his hands. The powerful mana continued to swirl, growing clearer and denser until it looked almost solid, proof of the will he refused to let break. Then Adrian struck the ground, a raw cry tearing out of him as the pressure of the mana threatened to rip him apart from the inside. His face twisted in a desperate scream, sweat flying from him as he pushed through the pain. Rage and disbelief burned through his thoughts as he cursed the weakness of this body and demanded what kind of frailty this was. Adrian jolted awake as if thrown back onto a brutal, snow-covered battlefield, with bodies scattered across the white ground around him. His mind roared in frustration, demanding to know what was wrong with this body. He let out a low, irritated groan, still remembering the overwhelming power he had once possessed. Back then, if he wanted something, he could simply take it, buy it, or force others to move according to his will. Then a soft knock cut through the tension, and the voice of the Royal Guard captain sounded from beyond the door, respectfully calling out to His Highness. Later, Adrian sat at a table while a royal maid carefully offered him a compliment, even clarifying that it was meant as praise and not some special flattery for him personally. But Adrian's thoughts were elsewhere, silently judging that even this was still not enough. The maid's expression turned serious as she continued asking him to please take Queen Margarita's feelings into consideration. Adrian simply remained seated, quietly absorbing her words without giving much away. Across from him, a flicker of fear passed through the maid's eyes as she silently hoped he would not throw the bowl at her like he had done before. Her gaze stayed fixed on him, cautious and tense, waiting for even the smallest sign of what he might do next. Then Adrian's eyes suddenly snapped open, as if a sharp realization had just struck him straight through the chest. The glowing blue liquid sitting in front of him was not ordinary at all. It was overflowing with raw mana, so dense and vivid that he could practically feel the power radiating from it. The royal maid offered the bowl to him, and Adrian took it immediately, snatching it up without the slightest hesitation. He drank the entire thing in one go, swallowing down the mana-rich liquid so quickly that the bowl was emptied almost instantly. The maid stared at him in complete shock, her mouth falling open as worry spread across her face at the sudden intense way he had consumed it. With a quiet clink, the empty bowl settled back down, drained completely, as if the glowing liquid had never been there at all. Adrian dismissed her casually, asking if she was free to go, and the maid quickly stammered that she was. "Your Highness." A faint smirk then tugged at his lips as he ordered her to bring one more, only this time with fire. The air around him began to crackle, faint blue light pulsing through the room like sparks before a storm. Even in his new, heavier body, Adrian radiated a vibrant blue aura, his eyes burning with intense magical power. A closer look at his glowing blue eyes revealed the fierce determination behind them as he admitted just how effective the mana was. But even with that advantage, the amount was still nowhere near enough, and worse, whatever he consumed scattered far too quickly, fading away after only a single day. Adrian turned sharply toward the royal maid, his attention locking onto her as he called out again. Without hesitation, he demanded to know whether she had any more of that potent mana-infused liquid. Only a few days later, Adrian had changed dramatically. His body looked leaner and more mature. His white hair framed his face sharply, and his intensely glowing blue eyes shone as powerful energy crackled around his hand, a dangerous smile curling across his lips. He had repeated the process countless times, refining it again and again, and now he could finally feel it. The moment had come when he could forge a mana heart. With that foundation in place, Adrian knew he would be able to create something far more powerful than anything this weak body should have been capable of holding. But just as his eyes flared with unnatural blue light, a searing pain tore through him, cutting across his body like fire from the inside. Then he remembered the truth of it. This process had never been gentle, and from the very beginning, forging a mana heart was meant to be agonizing. The pain intensified until it forced him down to his knees, and the pressure inside his chest swelled so violently it felt as though the gathered mana would make him explode. Even then, Adrian forced himself to endure. His hands radiated intense blue energy as he continued shaping the mana heart, refusing to let the unstable power scatter again. He reminded himself through the pain that creating a mana heart was never supposed to be easy, especially not in a body as damaged and unprepared as this one. But he could not afford to lose consciousness now. Not when he had come this close to rebuilding the core of his strength. So Adrian pushed straight through the agony, raw mana exploding all around him until the room seemed swallowed by a total blackout of power. His jaw clenched hard, and his electric blue eyes blazed as he fought against the insane pressure building inside him, forcing himself to stay awake and endure every second of it. Adrian dropped to one knee, forcing his trembling body to steady itself as he gathered every bit of focus he had left. He knew that with mana this unstable, even the smallest mistake could tear everything apart and wipe him out completely. With one hand glowing in brilliant blue light, he reached straight into the chaos of wild mana and seized it by force, crushing its violent flow beneath his will. He warned himself not to rush, carefully guiding each unstable current as though one careless movement could make it explode. Thin streams of blue energy began to ignite one by one, moving slowly and precisely as they traced the path needed to form a new heart of mana within him. At last, the new mana heart flickered into existence. Fragile and bright, a glowing sphere that crackled as its power seeped through every part of him. A deep hum vibrated through the air as the creation completed, leaving behind a small orb shining with intense blue light. Completely drained but undeniably victorious, Adrian sat there in silence, staring down at the incredible mana heart he had managed to create with his own hands. His focus remained locked in place, and mana continued to crackle around his body, restless and alive, as if the newly formed core was still settling inside him. A powerful thrum pulsed from deep within his core. Adrian slowly raised his head, eyes blazing with renewed resolve, and vowed that next time he would forge a mana heart for another purpose entirely. But beneath that thought, his true ambition burst forward. A swirling blue orb formed in his hand, and the answer became clear. This mana heart was not for anyone else. It was for him, and him alone. Adrian rose to his feet, chest lifted with pride, and a victorious grin spread across his face as he shouted out his triumph with no attempt to hide his excitement. Then a blinding golden aura erupted around him, flooding the space with radiant power as the mana heart finally stabilized and revealed its completed form. For a brief moment, Adrian froze where he stood, surprise flashing across his widened eyes as something unexpected appeared before him. A clear message announced itself before him, declaring that the mana heart had been successfully created. Right after forging the mana heart, a sudden status window appeared in front of him, leaving Adrian staring in confusion as he wondered what was happening and why securing the origin was being treated as something so critical. He questioned why this strange power was surfacing now of all times, only for the status window to begin restoring a vital connection to the origin, stopping him cold in disbelief. The link snapped into place all at once, and a powerful instinct twisted in Adrian's gut, warning him that this moment was not something he could simply walk back from. Then an absurd new power unlocked before him, the third eye. But the message made it clear that he could only use it for an extremely limited time, leaving him stunned by both the gift and its warning. Even with that restriction, this was no ordinary ability. For the short time it lasted, it promised to sharpen his sight and hearing to a level far beyond anything normal senses could reach. In an instant, Adrian's vision expanded violently, flooding his mind with details so sharp that the world seemed to split open before him. Far beyond the room, his sight reached toward a distant forest, revealing trees and shadows with impossible clarity. Then his focus caught on a pristine white flower, every delicate petal standing out so clearly that it felt as though it were blooming right in front of his eyes. His hearing sharpened just as dramatically, catching every faint sound with unbelievable precision. Yet even as his senses opened wider than ever before, Adrian still could not tell the full extent of what this new authority could truly do. Outside the room, the maid quickly hushed the guard, reminding him that the king hated unnecessary commotion. Then, as if it were nothing strange, she mentioned that she could hear Queen Margarita's voice clearly through the door. The next moment, searing agony tore through Adrian's body. A guttural cry forced its way from his throat as the overwhelming rush of power began crushing his senses from every direction. His mana had vanished completely. The message warned that his internal mana had been fully depleted, and immediately after, the use of his authorities was forcibly terminated. Even as the power faded away, Adrian understood with chilling clarity what the warning had truly meant. So that was the cost of something being extremely limited, an authority that could empty him in a single use. Still, for one fleeting moment, he had seen everything. He had sensed every direction without a single blind spot, as if the entire world had been laid bare inside his mind. But the greatest thing he wanted, the origin itself, remained far beyond his reach, still too distant for him to grasp no matter how powerful that glimpse had been. For now, Adrian understood the only path available to him. By repeatedly using magic power, he could slowly strengthen his eyesight and improve what he could perceive, even if the gains were small. A mischievous grin crept across his face as a glowing orb appeared in his hand. His thoughts were already racing ahead, because before anything else, he needed to find a way to expand his mana pool. The pieces began turning in his mind, one after another, as Adrian quietly started building the next step of his plan. His eyes burned with unyielding resolve, bright and steady, showing that he had no intention of stopping with such a small beginning. Then a powerful declaration rang out as though descending from the heavens itself, announcing that it would be brought forth now. Inside the sprawling majesty of the castle, however, Adrian's thoughts were already fixed on his first true mission, mastering this unfamiliar human body. A voice filled with admiration praised his determination as truly admirable. Soon after, a stunning woman dressed with elegant grace stepped forward, a radiant smile on her lips as she extended her hand in a clear invitation. Yet Adrian slumped across a luxurious couch, looked far from impressed. A firm voice pressed down on him, insisting that he had to learn how to properly value the body he now possessed. A formidable figure stood over him, casting a heavy presence that made the room feel tighter with every passing second. His gaze was sharp, steady, and impossible to ignore, fixed on Adrian with a severity that left no room for excuses. As he studied Adrian closely, the man's expression darkened with a grim realization. Adrian had truly lost his memory. Then Queen Margarita's voice came from off to the side, ordering her brother to help this child. And the man muttered under his breath that he had been wondering who she meant. The man stood before the royal guard captain as the unseen voice made the truth plain. This was Adrian, the king's son, and the captain's only nephew. Queen Margarita continued pushing the issue, pointing out how strangely silent Adrian had become. The captain looked visibly annoyed and considered the whole thing a waste of his time, but he also decided that taking a quick look would not damage his reputation. That quick look left Adrian gasping on the floor, his body trembling as he struggled beneath the overwhelming force that had just been used against him. Standing over him, the scarred royal made the rules brutally clear. Vale Ballerhard declared that Adrian would receive a proper royal education starting immediately, and if Adrian ever forgot his place, he would personally make sure the prince never woke up again. A chilling smirk spread across Vale Ballerhard's face as he threw down the challenge, daring Adrian to give everything he had because no one could say what might change if he truly struggled. With defiance blazing in his eyes, Adrian actually considered turning the whole situation around and teaching his uncle a thing or two about swordsmanship. But he dismissed the thought as ridiculous almost immediately, grudgingly admitting that for an imperial prince with absurd talent, being forced into a harsh situation like this was probably unavoidable. Vale Ballerhard's smirk widened as he watched Adrian's anger and resentment simmer just beneath the surface, clearly enjoying how badly the prince wanted to snap back. Then, with a predatory gleam in his eye, Vale Ballerhard offered a new challenge, suggesting that they make a bet. Adrian's eyes burned as he boldly declared that he would surpass Vale Ballerhard in only 6 months, while his uncle silently hoped the prince would not end up regretting that reckless arrogance. With that same fierce fire in his gaze, Adrian laid out the stakes to his uncle. If he lost, he would obey completely, but if he won, Vale Ballerhard would grant him one powerful wish. Vale Ballerhard, ever calculating, simply watched him with a strategist's smile, taking in every word without showing the slightest sign of being shaken. Then he accepted the bet with cool confidence, clearly relishing the thought of watching Adrian struggle his way through the brutal challenge ahead. But that burst of confidence didn't last for long. The fire in Adrian's chest cooled almost immediately as reality came crashing down on him, and even he had to admit he had been far too sure of himself. Sweat gathered along his brow, his breathing tightened, and the weakness of this body pressed down on him harder than any enemy. He clenched his teeth in bitter frustration, silently cursing the fragile body he had been forced to work with. No matter how sharp his will was, this pathetic strength kept dragging him back, and he was completely fed up with feeling so limited. Then, as if his stubbornness itself had taken form, a brilliant blue light suddenly flared around his leg. The energy wrapped around him in a sharp, blazing surge, gathering at his foot like a spark ready to explode. In the next instant, that power hurled him upward. Adrian shot toward the sky with one simple, humiliating goal in mind. Before anything else, before pride or glory, he had to conquer this miserable little fence. Vale Ballerhard's amusement vanished as his eyes widened. For the first time, the easy look on his face cracked, replaced by a flicker of genuine shock as Adrian's hidden potential began to show itself right in front of him. Adrian's magic continued to pulse through the air, each faint thud of power making the blue glow around him shimmer brighter. Vale Ballerhard stared at him in disbelief, his eyes stretched wide as he barely managed to force out Adrian's name through the shock lodged in his throat. Adrian, on the other hand, didn't even flinch. His expression stayed calm, almost cold, and his eyes remained fixed ahead as though this was nothing worth getting worked up over. Vale Ballerhard's jaw dropped open, and his voice rang out with disbelief. He stared straight at Adrian as if the answer should have been impossible, demanding to know whether he had truly created a man of heart. Adrian only gave him a smug little look, as if the glowing power around him were barely worth mentioning. With maddening casualness, he glanced down and asked if Vale meant this, then calmly admitted that he had made it not too long ago. A confident grin slowly spread across Adrian's face. Then he leaned into the moment, practically throwing the challenge back at Vale Ballerhard as he asked whether his uncle was starting to regret making that bet. Vale Ballerhard looked so stunned that his eyes nearly jumped from their sockets. For a moment, all his usual composure broke apart, and the only sound he could manage was a bewildered noise caught in his throat. His uncle's face twisted with frustration, and he quickly corrected himself, cutting off his first reaction entirely. No, that wasn't the real question. What Vale Balorhard truly wanted to know was where in the world Adrian had learned how to forge a mana heart in the first place, even as a faint disbelieving chuckle slipped into the air. Vale Balorhard's thoughts churned wildly as he kept staring at Adrian. No matter how he looked at it, the sight before him refused to make sense, because a mana heart was supposed to be far beyond anything Adrian should have been able to create. Adrian's eyes widened slightly, and a strained breath caught in his throat when Vale Balorhard's voice thundered through the room. His uncle demanded to know how Adrian had mastered a technique that only the weakest and most desperate would ever bother learning. The shock of it seemed to split the very sky. A sharp crackle rolled through the air, and birds burst from the trees in a frantic storm of wings, scattering as if even nature had been startled by the revelation. The entire castle seemed to tremble as a thunderous cry erupted from within, the sheer force of Vale Balorhard's disbelief echoing through the walls. Adrian's mind raced beneath his calm expression, thoughts crashing together like a storm behind his eyes. But Vale Balorhard quickly cut through the tension, forcing himself to explain. He began with the basics, declaring that a mana heart was far from what Adrian seemed to believe it was. Adrian's jaw dropped as the truth hit him. The so-called mana heart, the technique he had relied on, was treated in this era as nothing more than a crude method learned only by low-ranked mages. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. His eyes narrowed, his voice sharpened, and he immediately challenged the claim, asking what Vale Balorhard could possibly mean by that. Vale Balorhard didn't bother dressing it up with more words. He decided it would be quicker to show the difference himself, ordering Adrian to watch carefully as he flicked his wrist and unleashed a blinding turquoise aura from the center of his palm. The raw power twisted in the air, curling and tightening until it took on a perfect shape. In seconds, the loose glow hardened into a flawless ring of mana, shining with controlled, polished force. The turquoise ring pulsed brightly, each wave of light showing just how refined Vale Balorhard's control truly was. Adrian stared at the vibrant blue energy, stunned into silence as one question burned hotter and hotter in his mind. What exactly was he looking at? The blue energy throbbed with incredible pressure, gathering in the air like something alive. Then, without warning, it gave off a sharp and violent crackle. The ring burst apart into countless glowing fragments, scattering like shattered glass. Adrian's eyes widened as he understood the impossible thing happening before him. Mana wasn't supposed to break that way. For one breath, it seemed as if Vale Balorhard was using a mana heart too. But his uncle quickly made it clear that this method was not merely stronger, it changed everything. That truth stood in brutal contrast to the old Eli family. The very people who had once pioneered mana hearts, only to fade into obscurity a century earlier. Their fall had become proof that the age of mana hearts was long over, and in the present day, no sensible mage or knight would willingly rely on such an outdated method. As Adrian absorbed everything, he bent over a document titled Mana Chaining Basic Theory. Page by page, the realization settled over him in silence. The world of magic had advanced far beyond anything Gruhorn had ever imagined in his ancient days. The text laid out the modern method with startling clarity. Mages no longer depended on mana hearts the old way. Instead, they guided their power through radiant orbs that acted as refined channels. Knights, meanwhile, displayed their strength in an entirely different way. They formed intricate chains of mana to draw out power, and the number and complexity of those woven chains became proof of just how far they had risen. Mana chaining began with a single luminous strand coiling around the blade, wrapping the sword in a clean line of energy. Then, in a flash, that one chain split into two, then three, then four, the glowing patterns multiplying with dizzying speed until a fifth chain burst into place and completed the breathtaking structure. Adrian studied the wild-looking diagrams with a serious gaze, tracing the strange formations with his eyes. As much as he hated to admit it, the theory wasn't useless at all. In fact, it had far more merit than he expected. His attention settled on the section labeled Basic Theory, written by a man named Ernest Altringen. The moment Adrian read that name, something stirred in the back of his mind, and a faint sense of familiarity began to ring like a distant bell. Recognition struck him all at once. Adrian's eyes snapped open with fresh interest, his expression sharpening as the name finally began to connect with an old memory. Far back in the past, a legend had once stepped onto the stage of history. A powerful voice had called out to a swordsman gripping a blade with a brilliant blue gem set into its hilt, demanding to know if he was truly the famed sword saint. The hooded figure held his sword with quiet, overwhelming force, and gave his name without hesitation. Ernest Altringen. His eyes burned with an eerie light as he declared that he had come to see who was more worthy of bearing the title of sword saint, and the old records remembered him as a man who mastered bizarre arts that crossed the boundary between sword and spell. A spark of understanding lit up in Adrian's mind. No wonder the name had felt familiar. It belonged to someone tied to a legend even Gruhorn still remembered. A knowing smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. Adrian leaned back more comfortably into his seat, letting that old memory settle as if he had just found an amusing piece of the past buried in the present. And then came the natural question that lingered after any old legend resurfaced. What had become of that man in the end? Not long after, deep within the splendid halls of the royal palace, Adrian found himself facing the royal guard captain and a maid, the tension between them tightening the air of the room. He turned his attention toward the captain, his eyes carrying a sharp, testing glint. With the book close at hand, Adrian challenged him directly, asking whether he would dare read it himself. The royal guard captain met Adrian's gaze without backing down and snapped out a firm warning, telling him not to open the book at all. But Adrian ignored the caution completely, holding the forbidden tome in his hands as the captain's voice rose in disbelief at the sheer nerve of what he was about to do. A defiant smirk crossed Adrian's face. He glanced away as though the warning barely mattered, letting out a low, amused sound that made his refusal even more blatant. As his eyes moved across the ancient writing, Adrian stated that he couldn't find even the smallest trace of what he was searching for inside these quarters. The pages offered plenty of old words, but none of the answer he wanted. The captain's expression hardened into stern disapproval. With a sharp click of his tongue, he demanded to know whether Adrian truly failed to understand just how dangerous the situation had become. Then, as if answering the captain's challenge for him, a heavy sound burst through the room. Brilliant blue energy surged outward and swallowed the book in Adrian's hand, bathing the old tome in a fierce, unnatural light. Power pulsing from the book seemed to carry a hidden truth with it. Not every human heart was merely a mana heart. Some were shaped with a specific purpose and class in mind. Adrian looked up with those same blazing blue eyes, his stare daring and intense as he left one pointed question hanging between them. The royal guard captain stood visibly shaken by the force radiating from Adrian and the book. His eyes widened, and he finished Adrian's unfinished question himself, asking whether he had ever heard of such a thing. At times there were people much like the ancient mercenaries, fools who convinced themselves they were heroes born from forgotten centuries. A golden-haired youth stood before the royal guard captain, his gaze burning with intensity as he delivered a question heavy enough to change the entire mood of the room. He demanded to know whether the captain understood what happened to those who failed to choose a side between two warring kings. As he spoke, images of ancient warriors wrapped in glowing power flashed like memories of a brutal battlefield, their blades clashing in the chaos of war. The blond youth's eyes gleamed as he pressed even harder. He asked whether the captain believed he was somehow different from those conflicted souls of the past, then threw down a direct challenge, daring him to try bringing down a double-chain knight. The royal guard captain answered with an unreadable smirk resting on his face. Coolly and without hesitation, he said that he would become Adrian's guardian, exactly as Queen Margarita had always wanted. But the blond youth's proud front didn't hold as firmly as before. His eyes wavered for the briefest moment, and that small crack in his expression revealed the doubt he had been trying to hide, as he quietly admitted he wasn't entirely sure that promise could really be trusted. The tension carried them into a smaller, darker space that felt almost like a dungeon, where the conversation pressed on with even heavier weight. The royal guard captain kept his gaze fixed on the mysterious blond youth, while the youth stood upright among the others, his presence impossible to ignore as the captain's words sank deep into him. The royal guard captain's voice rang out sharply, cutting straight through the room. He challenged the young prince head-on, demanding to know whether Adrian had truly just questioned his worthiness to serve as a guardian. Then a commanding figure stepped forward, blue energy blazing fiercely in his eyes. With the kind of authority that made the air around him tighten, he announced himself as a count of the kingdom and the commander of the Black Spear Cavalry. The royal guard captain's voice followed like a formal declaration, adding weight to the reveal as he named him the master of the Black Spear Cavalry. He went even further, stressing that this man was also one of the 5 silver lions who had sworn their loyalty. At that moment, the knight's entire body flared with a crushing blue aura, power pouring from him in waves. The captain's voice grew even stronger as he revealed the most important part. This was a man who had sworn himself to Adrian's bloodline, and the fierce light burning in his eye made that loyalty feel absolute. Then the captain declared his name with unmistakable force: Double-Chain Knight Vale Ballarhard. Those words settled over the room like a verdict, making it clear exactly what kind of protector stood before Adrian. Vale Ballarhard's presence filled the space completely, his armor catching the light as if he had stepped out of a battlefield. But Adrian refused to shrink back, throwing the challenge right back at him and asking whether that was really supposed to be enough qualification. Count Ballarhard didn't waste a single breath answering. He simply placed his hand on the hilt of his sword, and that silent movement alone spoke louder than any threat could have. A faint smirk touched his face, and the glint in his eyes radiated absolute confidence, as though defeat had never once crossed his mind. But before the tension could explode into action, the royal guard captain moved fast, grabbing Adrian and shouting for Count Ballarhard to stand down. Count Ballarhard's smirk remained exactly where it was. His piercing blue eyes stayed locked on the captain, and not a trace of worry or hesitation showed on his face. As for Adrian, his grin only stretched wider. There was something wild and unsettling in that smile, especially with that eerie light burning deep in his eyes. Not long after, Adrian was on the ground, battered but far from broken. Bruises marked his body, yet that chilling grin still clung to his face as a brutal impact rang out, followed by the sickening sensation of something being torn away. He folded forward, clutching his stomach as a rough groan forced its way out of him. The pain made one thing brutally clear. He had come far too close to dying, and yet the sinister figure with glowing eyes only looked down at him with a mocking smirk. It was almost as if the whole thing had been staged for pity, a twisted little performance designed to make him seem more pitiful than he really was. Back in the present, a heavier Adrian stomped through the palace halls, every step carrying the heat of his anger. His thoughts were still stuck on that scheming bastard, that devilish bastard, and the rage simmering inside him only grew hotter the more he remembered. Then, as if fate had decided to mock him, the very person he was cursing appeared right in front of him. The man greeted Adrian in a voice so politely cold that it only made the encounter feel more irritating. Adrian's eyes nearly bulged out of his head. It was the royal physician. The physician lowered himself in a bow, his tone dripping with false humility, as he thanked Adrian for remembering a lowly servant like him. Adrian immediately demanded to know why he had come, but the royal physician answered with a revelation that made the situation even more troublesome. Queen Margarita herself had ordered him to use healing magic, and the quiet power struggle beneath the palace surface began to show its teeth. Adrian was furious, his face darkening as contempt poured into every word. He wanted nothing more than to drive the royal physician away before the man could meddle any further. He snapped that he didn't need any healing, and ordered the physician to get out. But even as the words left his mouth, his mind flashed back to a brutal memory. A younger, sharper warrior falling through a deadly blizzard, a cold echo of the power he once possessed. Back in the lavish present, Adrian glared down at the extravagant food laid out before him. The sight only made him grumble about how wasteful it all was. His irritation barely held behind his clenched expression. Meanwhile, the royal physician remained completely composed. He simply watched in silence, his calm eyes carrying a cold, calculating depth that made him impossible to read. Suddenly, the heavy quiet of the grand hall broke apart as Gillian Leonberg entered with a maid and a guard at his side. His voice cut sharply through the chamber as he called out for his brother, and his powerful stride drew every eye toward him. Gillian's relentless pace carried him deeper into the hall, clearly determined to find Adrian. And there Adrian was, seated alone at an enormous table, completely absorbed in devouring the feast before him. The body that had once belonged to a lean and battle-ready warrior now looked drastically different. To put it plainly, Adrian clearly hadn't been skipping any meals, and the contrast with his old self was almost shocking. Right in the middle of a bite, a snide voice broke through the silence. The remark came out with open disbelief, wondering what in the world had happened to this guy. Then Gillian was suddenly standing over him, his presence sharp and imposing. He greeted Adrian by saying it had been a while, only to follow it with a cutting jab, asking if he still considered himself the strongest. Gillian took in Adrian's new appearance without even trying to hide his reaction. He said he had heard about the little accident, but seeing him in person was even worse than the rumors had made it sound. Adrian's face twitched, but Gillian only pressed harder, letting a cold "what a shame" hang between them. Finally, Adrian shoved his plate aside and snapped, demanding to know what Gillian wanted, and whether he had only come to provoke him, asking if a prince had nothing better to do. A dark, furious glint sparked in Adrian's eyes. His jaw tightened, and the irritation he had been holding back began to rise dangerously close to the surface. Gillian's thoughts, however, were merciless. It was rich for someone who had supposedly stabbed himself with a sword to talk like that. With a faint smirk tugging at his lips, he finally revealed that he had heard a very interesting piece of news. Adrian's expression tightened as Gillian continued. He said he had heard about the bet Adrian made with Count Balerhard, and with a quick flash of his hand, a small wicked blade caught the light as he taunted him about dueling a double-chain knight. Cold smirk spread across Gillian's face. His eyes burned with an unspoken challenge, making it clear that he wasn't simply here to chat. Adrian lowered his gaze for a moment, his thoughts churning like a storm beneath the surface. Then his head snapped back up, eyes blazing as he threw out a challenge of his own, asking how Gillian would like him as an opponent. Morning arrived, and Adrian was already seated at the table, prepared to face whatever the day had waiting for him. Across from him, the royal guard captain began to speak, his tone carrying the weight of something serious. Adrian couldn't help but scoff, clearly annoyed by what he was hearing. The captain, however, only laughed at his reaction, seeming to find the entire situation far more entertaining than Adrian did. Adrian still couldn't understand why every legion commander seemed to be like this, especially when even the King of Leonberg had praised their skill in both swordsmanship and magic. Then his mind drifted to that one punk who had somehow woven 2 black chains at only 14, showing off speed that was honestly absurd. Elsewhere, the royal physician was completely absorbed in his own work. Raw magic crackled around his hands as he concentrated, weaving together an intricate spell with unnerving precision. Back with Adrian, he shot the captain a look filled with disbelief. Just then, a royal maid hurried into the room, bowing low in apology for her lateness while carrying a stack of letters in her hands. The maid treated the letters with careful respect, clearly aware that every one of them was meant for Adrian alone. She offered them forward with both hands, her posture formal and cautious. Adrian took the letters with a puzzled expression. He muttered under his breath, wondering why people who had never bothered writing to him before were suddenly sending him so much mail. The paper rustled softly in his hands as Adrian's eyes narrowed. His focus sharpened like a blade, suspicion burning brighter with every line he read. He remained at the table while the captain and maid stood nearby, waiting in silence. You could practically see the thoughts turning behind Adrian's eyes as he worked through the strange flood of letters. And the contents were outrageous. One letter crawled with apologies and begged for some kind of deal. Another came from a guildmaster buried in serious trouble, and a third practically pleaded for the prince to step in and help. Taken together, the messages all carried the same stench of desperation. People were reaching out from every direction, but Adrian didn't believe their sudden sincerity for even a second. Then a sly grin slowly crept across his face. He saw the perfect opening, a chance to legally beat that scoundrel into the ground. Adrian flashed a knowing look toward the captain, who could only stare back in shock and let out a startled protest. Adrian then turned his attention to the maid, who managed only a hesitant response. She looked away uneasily, as if the full weight of what he had just implied had finally settled over both of them. With one final rustle of the letter, Adrian's expression hardened into cunning determination. Whatever trap or opportunity had landed in his hands, he was already prepared to turn the entire situation upside down. A wooden sword came crashing down with brutal force, the impact ringing out like a heavy crack of thunder through the training ground. The weapon bounced once, then skidded across the damp, fractured stone floor, clattering loudly against the cracks left beneath their feet. As Adrian reached out to take the fallen sword back, Vale Balorhard stood over him with a cold, unforgiving stare. His voice cut down from above, making it clear that Adrian had to understand one thing first. If this was happening to him, then he lacked even the smallest proper foundation in swordsmanship. Vale Balorhard continued without softening his tone. He admitted that he hadn't wanted to believe it at first, but the thing Adrian had lost because of his weakness was not merely one battle. Then Vale drove the blade of his words in even deeper, saying that Adrian might have avoided this mess entirely if his personality had been even a little better. Before Adrian could properly answer, a swift kick slammed into him. Pain shot through his body in an instant, cutting off whatever complaint had been rising in his throat. His eyes flashed with a sharp blue glow as he folded around the pain, clutching his stomach and crying out about his aching muscles. Vale Balorhard paused at the sight, looking down at him with a sudden hint of suspicion. Then Vale's expression shifted slightly, as if something had only just occurred to him. With surprise slipping into his voice, he asked whether Adrian had not received healing magic at all. Even so, Vale Balorhard did not let the lesson soften. He laid down the truth with the weight of a commander, telling Adrian that a true knight understood how important the foundation was before anything else. He grabbed Adrian by the collar and pulled him close, forcing him to listen. These were not decorative moves meant to look impressive. They were the building blocks needed to recover the strength Adrian had lost. A low growl rumbled from Vale's throat, and his stare locked onto Adrian with frightening intensity, as if he would not allow the prince to look away from the lesson. Looking down at Adrian, Vale made his decision clear. No matter how stubborn the prince was, no matter how many times he collapsed, Vale would teach him properly. With Adrian still on the floor, Vale hammered the point home. This technique was not some optional trick for show. It was the absolute bedrock every knight had to stand on. Then, with a sudden burst of force, a blinding blue-green aura erupted around Vale Balorhard. His armor and sword blazed with raw magical power as he raised the glowing blade high and named it the kingdom's training sword. The sword shone brighter and brighter, its edge vibrating with fierce light until it seemed to scream with power, the gleam sharpening into a brilliant flash. As the energy reached its peak, Vale Balorhard's eyes ignited with the same electric blue radiance. The power pouring from him made the air feel heavy and alive. He moved so fast that his body almost blurred, the weapon carving downward in a clean arc, while a trail of blue-green light followed behind it. Every muscle in Vale's body tightened and released in perfect rhythm, gathering his strength from head to toe and driving all of it into that single strike. The air twisted around the glowing blade as it descended, warping under the pressure of the attack, as if nothing in front of it could possibly stop it. Vale's eyes flared brighter in that same vivid blue, burning with the power moving through his entire body. That light proved the technique had fully awakened, not just in the sword, but through the knight wielding it. The final path of the swing became nothing but a blur, a streak of radiance slicing through the space before Adrian's eyes. It was pure concentrated force given shape, a single motion refined until it looked less like swordsmanship and more like a natural disaster. Then the strike landed with a deafening crash, the sound booming across the training ground like stone splitting under lightning. Ground beneath them burst apart, fragments of stone flying outward as the shockwave ripped through the floor in every direction. Adrian was hurled backward by the concussive force, his body thrown across the broken ground while fresh cracks split open around him. He stared with wide, stunned eyes, unable to speak for a moment. The power he had just witnessed was so overwhelming that even his thoughts seemed to freeze. As the dust slowly settled, the destruction remained carved into the earth. Vale Balorhard stood completely unfazed, while Adrian could only gape at the torn-up ground, his mind stuck on the terrifying force of what had happened just now. That level of raw power was absurd, far beyond anything Adrian had expected from what was supposed to be a training session. Vale watched Adrian's reaction with icy calm, then let the lesson sink in. A real knight's strength, he made clear, was never just about swinging a sword. A sly smirk crossed Vale's face, as if he already knew Adrian had barely begun to understand. The kind of power he had just shown might be too much for the prince to grasp all at once. Adrian's stunned expression slowly changed into a wicked smirk. His eyes glinted with sudden realization, while the shattered ground still pulsed with blue energy, glowing like proof of the magical devastation Vale had unleashed. From within the swirling, crackling energy, a legendary name seemed to blaze into existence in brilliant blue light: Dragonslayer. Adrian's face shifted from shock to understanding as the full weight of that technique finally struck him. Adrian's eyes burned with power as his mind raced ahead. If he mastered this technique, it would not only mean victory, it might give him the strength to lead an entirely new knight order. Or perhaps, just perhaps, this one skill alone would be enough to win the bet. Then a chilling voice cut straight through that grand ambition, shutting it down with a simple declaration that there was no need. Even the idea of Adrian leading a new knight order after mastering such power was dismissed on the spot. Caught off guard, Adrian turned toward the voice, his thoughts stumbling over the claim. Lead another knight order? Just that? As if mastering Dragonslayer alone would already be enough. The sheer nerve of saying it so casually was almost insulting. A scarred, unyielding man had been watching everything unfold from the side. His expression barely changed, but a contemptuous huff slipped from him, carrying more judgment than a full speech. With his hand already resting near his sword, the scarred man finally gave in. His answer was short and rough, telling them to do as they pleased, and that curt permission sealed the moment. Then, before anyone could properly react, the man moved with impossible speed. His blade flashed through the air so quickly it looked more like a phantom than steel. He dropped into a battle-ready stance, and Adrian's eyes locked onto every part of the motion. The ground cracked under the force of his step, a raw display of power, yet people still whispered that this royal sword style was nothing more than a simple training exercise. Adrian clicked his tongue in bitter frustration. As much as he hated being impressed, he had to admit what he had just seen was undeniable. A force so natural and overwhelming, it felt almost like a phenomenon of the world itself. In a blinding flash, the sword erupted with brilliant blue energy humming with condensed power. This was the legendary Dragonslayer sword style, though ironically it was not a technique that could truly slay dragons. The fools who had inherited it in this era had forgotten what made the technique terrifying in the first place. The swordsman moved like a blur, blue power streaming behind every precise motion as he unleashed something that had once been treated as mere training. The blade struck down with devastating force, landing with the kind of impact that seemed to shake the very space around it. The sound echoed across the ground as the scarred swordsman lowered his weapon, his hard gaze fixed on the mark left behind. Adrian watched in silence, awe and frustration twisting together across his face. The scarred swordsman, clearly a master who knew exactly what he was doing, continued teaching through both words and action. He made the truth plain. Real power did not come from simply hoarding as much energy as possible inside the body. What mattered was guiding that power perfectly, letting it surge through you with the sharp, direct force of lightning racing through your veins. He drove the lesson in even deeper, explaining that strength had to rise from the bones, pass through the core, and flow all the way into the blade. It could never be reduced to a simple swing of the arm. Adrian took in every word, every motion, and every trace of power left behind. Then, with his gaze firm and his expression serious, he gave a solid nod of understanding. Scarred swordsman let out a tired sigh, as if the thought alone irritated him. He muttered that the legendary emperor's sword style, once treated as the height of battlefield technique, had fallen so far that people now used it as nothing more than a basic warm-up, with its real power buried beneath the dust of time. A fierce fire lit up in Adrian's eyes. The more he thought about it, the more certain he became that he would bring Dragonslayer back to life and force the world to understand that this technique was no dead relic. His hands clenched into tight fists, anger burning in his chest at the idea of such a legendary skill being thrown away like useless scrap. With that new purpose driving him, Adrian stepped forward, and from that day on, time blurred into a relentless march toward his goal. He threw himself into training without holding anything back, grinding his body down to its very limit from morning until night. A full week passed in a storm of sweat, pain, and constant effort. But Adrian's determination never once cracked under the pressure. Then an entire month slipped by, leaving him exhausted to the bone, yet undeniably stronger than the man who had first picked up the sword. All that brutal work began to show real results. Adrian could feel his progress accelerating at a ridiculous pace, and at last, he even reached the difficult chance stage he had been aiming for. Even better, the clumsy trait that had dragged down every movement and made his body feel awkward was finally gone. In its place came true general dexterity, allowing him to move with far more control. Adrian stood upright with his sword ready, carrying himself with a grace and confidence that had not been there before. He looked like someone reforged by sheer stubborn will, his entire presence sharper and more dangerous. He drew in a deep breath, released it slowly, and gave a quiet nod to himself, acknowledging just how much his body had changed through all that suffering. Blue energy sparked in Adrian's eyes as his fingers tightened around the sword hilt. Through the blade he could feel raw mana surging, alive and responsive beneath his grip. He had reached a level where the power was no longer some distant concept. He could feel it clearly now, and with that certainty settling in his chest, Adrian declared that he would swing the sword. His body moved with surprising smoothness, each motion flowing far more naturally than it had only a month earlier, as if the sword were finally beginning to answer him. But just as the motion gathered force, a sudden voice rang out from somewhere out of sight, sharply ordering him to stop. Adrian ignored the warning completely. Instead of pulling back, he pushed harder, realizing in that very moment that he had already surpassed the version of himself from yesterday. The voice shouted again, louder this time, telling him to stop. Adrian still refused, driving the technique forward as it became cleaner and sharper with every passing instant, until the unseen speaker finally snapped and yelled at him for not listening. In the middle of that powerful swing, Adrian held a wooden sword already glowing with strange otherworldly energy. The practice blade was cracked along its body, yet it still held together, pulsing softly from within as his hands gripped the hilt with crushing force. Then the hilt detonated with a thunderous crack, bursting apart as a torrent of raw energy erupted from the broken weapon. Elsewhere, beneath a merciless downpour, a younger man stood beside an older figure clad in heavy armor. With a rifle in his hands, the younger man looked down in silence, his expression unreadable through the rain streaming across his face. Back with Adrian, his hand tightened around yet another sword hilt. A sharp crack rang out as the weapon split violently, glowing with unstable mana before power burst outward once again. On the rain-soaked earth, a pool of crimson slowly spread. The younger man stared down at the gravely injured older figure before him, frozen by the sight of blood mixing with the stormwater. His voice came out barely above a broken whisper. With his eyes wide in terror and disbelief, the younger man choked out one word, "Uncle." Adrian now stood before a colossal cracked sword embedded deep in the ground, its overwhelming power radiating outward in a blinding golden burst. At the same time, the sharp sound of wood breaking tore through the storm of memory and training. A training dummy was wiped out completely, shattered by the sheer force released from the strike, as if it had never stood there at all. But the real storm was written across the young man's face. Tears ran down through the rain as he clenched his jaw, and a furious shout ripped from his throat, calling the fallen man a stupid fool. He dropped to his knees over his uncle, grief and anger tangling together as he demanded answers. Of all days, of all moments, why had his uncle gone out to train in weather like this? His rage boiled over even harder. If that had really been all there was to it, then his uncle would not have ended up lying there, unable to breathe. Then, like a miracle in the middle of the storm, the blood-soaked hand began to glow with an eerie, otherworldly light. In that desperate moment, the truth revealed itself. The hyper-focused trait could only be born under the pressure of extreme concentration. And there, in the crucible of pain and terror, the legendary ability finally awakened. Still shaken, the young man let out a bitter laugh that sounded almost like defiance toward fate itself. Through clenched emotion, he wondered whether he could really be fooled again. But that forced defiance collapsed almost immediately. His face twisted into a raw grimace of agony, every ounce of pain laid bare as the rain continued to pour over him. Then a towering familiar figure appeared above him, casting a heavy shadow through the rain. The young man could barely acknowledge the king of Leonberg's presence before his anger flared again, his fists tightening as if he were ready to fight, even with a guard standing nearby. Yet, under the king of Leonberg's cold, unwavering stare, that defiance slowly broke apart. The young man's head lowered, and the fight drained from him in a crushing display of defeat. Rain ran down his face, hiding the emotion he could no longer control, as he shut his eyes in pain. From above, the king of Leonberg's voice cut through the downpour, delivering a brutal judgment aimed straight at him. Then consciousness returned in a flicker. Adrian's eyes snapped open, and instead of rain and blood, he found himself staring into the luxury of a lavish room, confusion clouding his gaze. A heavy wave of disorientation rolled through him. For a moment, all he could do was lie there and wonder whether he had actually lost consciousness. He pushed himself upright, and the realization struck him with uncomfortable force. Adrian still did not truly understand the limits of this new body. In his former life, as the living sword grew horn, he had already conquered everything there was to master. He had been the nameless war hero, the ultimate swordmaster, whose legend had been carved into history and the founding force behind an entire kingdom. His old path had been nothing but conflict, a crimson road paved with endless battles and fallen enemies. Gruhorn had led wars to absolute victory, pushing beyond every limit while sharpening both body and soul through unbreakable will. A terrifying presence that guided heroes and shaped destinies like a blade cutting through fate itself. He had been a wise advisor and an extraordinary teacher, always standing close to greatness, yet still only as a third party who helped others claim the glory. Now, as Adrian stared down at his own hands, he finally understood why he had kept swinging the sword until his body collapsed into this state. For the first time, he had become drunk on the feeling that every drop of sweat, every ounce of effort, and every hard-earned result belonged entirely to him. He knew he had to reclaim both his strength and control over this body, until he could once again stand as someone who could say that whatever he desired, he would obtain it without delay. More than a month had passed since Adrian obtained the mana heart, and during that time, he had built up an enormous amount of mana. The next stage felt close now, almost as if it were calling to him from just beyond reach. His eyes burned with raw power. But even Adrian understood that the body he had now was not limitless. The problem was painfully clear. His body still could not fully keep pace with the ridiculous amount of mana gathering inside him. He needed only a little more to push through to the next level. Then, in a sudden breakthrough, the mana heart inside him expanded violently, swelling with a massive surge of power. With that breakthrough, electric blue mana erupted around Adrian's hand, crackling brightly as it wrapped his fingers in fierce light. It was a clear sign that his body was finally beginning to rise to meet the insane power coursing through him. The mana heart pulsed again, and a glowing alert flashed before Adrian's eyes, confirming that his body was evolving alongside the explosive surge of power. Raw, uncontrolled energy churned in the air, twisting around itself as crackling sparks of mana snapped and flashed with dangerous force. Adrian's gaze sharpened at once. His eyes locked onto the power surging inside him, watching it move as if he could finally see the shape of his own strength. His body swelled under the crushing pressure of the mana, muscles straining as if they were being forced beyond their limit. On his chest, a radiant symbol blazed to life, marking the moment he pushed through a barrier that had been holding him back. But Adrian quickly steadied himself. The pressure was intense, yet his expression settled into control, and a determined smirk touched his lips as he said they might as well see what came next. His fingers tightened around the hilt of his sword, gripping it with the quiet confidence of someone ready to test his new power for himself. A glowing status window flashed before him like a triumphant declaration, announcing that he had officially reached the rank of sword learner. And that was not all. Another line appeared right after it, revealing that Adrian had unlocked a new ability and could now release the most basic form of aura. A faint blue glow spilled from the blade, thin and ethereal at first, then sharpening into an electric aura around the sword. The energy hissed softly as it gathered along the edge, and Adrian's confidence grew with it, his smirk deepening as he declared that he could at least handle the basics now. Elsewhere, the scarred swordsman spoke with a grim look on his face, telling his younger companion that rumors had spread all throughout the kingdom. The younger man blinked in confusion, clearly thrown off, and asked what kind of rumors he meant. The veteran knight clicked his tongue in irritation, already tired just thinking about it. He explained that the rumors were about the younger man's little group, and from his tone alone, it was obvious even he had grown sick of hearing them. Trying to steer the conversation somewhere more practical, the younger man suggested that it might be easier to simply find a duel opponent and settle everything properly. Meanwhile, a powerful knight wearing a knowing smirk considered the matter of an opponent. As for that, he already had someone in mind, and Adrian, radiating absolute confidence, made it clear that he had already chosen who he wanted to face. But who could that opponent possibly be? The thought gave way to a brutal snowy wasteland, where Vale Balarhard, the double-chain knight, stood among the fallen with his weapon humming in his hand, before revealing that he had brought the person Adrian had asked for. Vale Balarhard seemed caught off guard for a moment, the surprise flashing across his face before he could fully hide it. After regaining his composure, Vale Balarhard handed Adrian a scroll and corrected himself respectfully. He confirmed that he had indeed brought what Adrian requested, the list of everyone who wished to challenge His Highness to a duel. Adrian simply smirked, wearing the look of someone who had already expected this. Vale hesitated before adding a warning, but Adrian cut him off first, asking if his uncle was suggesting he should merely hold practice duels with them and what the problem would be if he did. Vale Balarhard's expression turned grave as he revealed the real concern. From what he had heard, these challengers were practically marching against Adrian like crusaders, and many of them cared less about a fair fight than about using the duel to win favor. Adrian remained completely unfazed. His smirk did not fade at all as he calmly stated that he already knew exactly what they were after. Vale still looked worried and tried one last time to make him listen. That was precisely why Adrian needed to hear him out, but even as he spoke, his armored figure stood in stern silence, gleaming with the weight of a man who knew the danger ahead. Elsewhere, a blonde-haired figure held a knife in hand and barked out one simple but critical order during the duel. They only had to make sure no one died. Then, with a challenging smirk, he pressed further, asking if granting him that much of a favor was really too difficult. Several days later, the first duel finally arrived, and Taylor Talheim walked toward the imposing palace with deep concern etched across his face. The first prince's palace rose ahead of him in all its grandeur, its elegant walls and overwhelming splendor standing in sharp contrast to the turmoil churning inside his chest. His footsteps echoed across the ornate floor as his thoughts burned with resentment. This was the first prince's palace, the place where that scoundrel lived, and the man walking inside was Taylor Talheim, the formidable son of a mere baronial family. Then the memory snapped back to a few years earlier. Taylor gripped a crumpled paper in his hand, rage simmering beneath his calm exterior as the humiliation of the past rose up again. As he stared ahead, his anger boiled over in silence. To him, that man was arrogant only because he had seized power ahead of others, and becoming emperor through cheating was nothing less than an unforgivable disgrace. His family's legacy had been stained with humiliation. His grandfather had suffered an insult from the Prince of Leonberg that could never be forgiven, and his father had been crushed by that same prince in front of the world, leaving their honor shattered until nobles and servants alike treated them as a laughingstock. Taylor's eyes burned with a fierce red glow as he snarled the name through clenched teeth. Adrian Leonberg. Looking up toward the storm-dark sky, Taylor made a cold vow that today Adrian would pay dearly for what had happened that day. This, he thought, would be his formal greeting to His Highness, First Prince Adrian Leonberg, as the memory flared with the image of two armored figures standing in a stark courtyard, their eyes fixed on what was about to unfold. The younger Taylor stood firm and introduced himself with clear resolve. He declared himself Taylor, the second son of the Talheim family, and as his hand tightened around the hilt of his sword, he added that he was a single-chain apprentice knight training in Talheim swordsmanship. Around him, the gathered crowd began to murmur. Some wondered why he still had not been given a proper title, while others whispered that he might even be on the verge of losing the one he already had. Taylor faced the prince, who was already looking down on him with that same arrogant and rude expression. Adrian's sneer made it clear he found the young knight's very existence amusing. Then Adrian spoke with a cutting kind of amusement, saying it was interesting that the common sense he had heard about still had not begun to sink into the young knight's head. His voice rang out loudly, heavy with sarcasm as he addressed him as Lord Talheim. Taylor somehow managed to keep his composure. Even with humiliation pressing down on him, he answered formally, saying it was an incomparable honor to meet the prince. Adrian brushed him off with a casual wave of his hand, then sneered that someone really ought to tell him the prince had arrived. Taylor's expression darkened when he was told he should have behaved better in the past. Adrian's words struck exactly where they were meant to, and Taylor flinched inwardly, bitterly thinking that the prince always dragged old matters back into the open. Now standing alone beneath the enormous castle, Taylor thought about the children of this era, his eyes hardening with a fierce and stubborn resolve. His hands tightened, ready for whatever came next, as he declared that they should begin. Across from him, Adrian Leonberg narrowed his eyes with disdain, his voice carrying a cold promise to teach Taylor exactly what happened to those who disrespected authority. Power crackled to life around Adrian, as brilliant blue magic ignited from his body, gathering for the lesson he intended to deliver. Complex runes flared within the storm of energy, forming the structure of a devastating spell. Cold resolve settled over Taylor's face as he met the prince's power head-on. His voice rang out with chilling steadiness, addressing Adrian as Your Highness. Then the attack was unleashed. Taylor's eyes widened as a desperate warning rang out, telling him to be careful, while Adrian struck like lightning and sent the spell flying toward its target in a streak of concentrated force. A phantom bird made of pure energy tore through the space between them, silent and deadly as it shot forward like a magical missile. Taylor met the attack directly. His own azure power burst outward in a defiant counterblast, crashing against the incoming spell and shattering it before it could overwhelm him. Adrian watched the spell get deflected, annoyance flickering across his face. His voice turned dismissive as he muttered that there were far too many useless soldiers involved. Adrian Leonberg's devastating blue magic slammed into Taylor Talheim's shimmering azure shield, and the collision exploded outward with raw, violent power. Taylor's gaze sharpened as the fierce blue light of his defense washed over his face. The protective energy surged around him, revealing the truth behind his strength, a true mana heart. The unyielding force of Taylor's counterattack sent Adrian reeling backward. He was thrown violently off balance as the ground beneath him cracked apart, spiderweb fractures spreading through the stone, while he barely managed to catch himself and regain his footing. Disbelief flashed across Adrian's face. He demanded to know how a simple mana heart could produce such an insane mana chain, wondering aloud if this impossible power came from Taylor having only one chain. Taylor, still glowing with leftover power, felt a strange tingling sensation ripple through him. The moment it began to fade, the hilt of the sword in his hand erupted with a blinding flash of blue light. His eyes shot wide open as the blade roared to life in his grip. For a breath, he could only stare in stunned disbelief, silently wondering what in the world had just happened. At the same time, Adrian and his knight heard the strange sound coming from the sword. Their expressions tightened with growing alarm as the weapon's bizarre reaction made the duel feel even more unpredictable. Adrian's thoughts suddenly raced faster than he could control, every instinct screaming at once as the horrifying answer settled into place. The strange reaction between him and the blade wasn't just power leaking out. It was sword resonance. The light pouring from the sword burst outward all at once, flaring so violently that it seemed to breathe with a will of its own. That wild, unrestrained power pulsed through the air, and everything about it felt completely impossible. In the next instant, Taylor Talheim moved like a shadow shot from a bow. His glowing blade cut through the air in a streak of searing blue, blazing forward like a comet aimed straight at its target. Adrian could do nothing but stare, his eyes wide and his mouth falling open, as the surge of power climbed far beyond anything he had expected to see. Taylor Talheim turned into a storm given human shape, swallowed by a twisting vortex of electric blue energy that wrapped around his body and blade. His eyes burned with fierce intensity, and the force rolling off him was so overwhelming that Adrian was left completely stunned beneath the deafening roar of the sword. A raw, primal roar tore from Taylor Talheim's throat, as his blade erupted in blinding blue radiance. Then he charged in headfirst, crossing the ground at a terrifying speed, each step carving a crackling trail of blue mana behind him. The strike landed with a force that shook the air itself, and a blinding burst of light exploded from the point of impact, swallowing the target beneath a violent wave of power. As the brightness finally faded, Taylor Talheim dropped back to the ground with clean, controlled precision, landing as if every movement had been measured from the start. The attack was over, but the force it left behind still hung in the air. Adrian and the scarred swordsman both stood frozen, unable to hide their shock at the unbelievable power that had just been unleashed. The scarred swordsman looked utterly lost, his mind latching onto the promise that forming a mana heart should have guaranteed success. But what he had just witnessed went far beyond that expectation. This was no ordinary result. Adrian gripped the pulsing orb tightly, feeling the wild power throb against his palm, as if it might break loose at any moment. He could sense the mana resonance swelling dangerously close to eruption. But beneath all of that, there was a far more serious twist waiting to reveal itself. Anger surged through him so fiercely that his expression twisted with barely contained fury. The sheer nerve of that voice questioning his existence made Adrian look ready to snap back without hesitation. Even with rage boiling under his skin, Adrian's focus sharpened like the edge of a blade. His eyes darkened with the promise of a storm, and his hand moved instinctively toward his sword. But the voice pressed on, telling him to calm himself and get his mind back under control. The world around Adrian seemed to smear and fade, yet his senses became frighteningly clear, locking onto something buried deep within him. A powerful hum began vibrating through his entire body, and somewhere inside his mind, a massive figure floated silently, completely submerged in glowing blue liquid. Soft bubbles drifted upward around that sunken figure, rising through the blue glow like fragments of a dream. Then Adrian's eyes snapped open, blazing with electric blue light as the energy inside him erupted through every part of his body. A commanding voice thundered through the emptiness, ordering him to awaken. Whether it was called a demon's sword or a holy sword no longer mattered, because names were only masks for the same terrifying power. As Adrian's awakening tore open a vast cosmic void, a fragment of his soul burst forth and took shape as a spectral dragon. Then that powerful voice cut straight through the void, declaring that even if Adrian had lost his memories, its own memories remained untouched, and with or without his permission, it would force him to awaken. The command slammed into Adrian like a shockwave, and one of his eyes ignited with intense blue light. A complex magical symbol burned inside his iris, glowing as if it had been carved directly into his soul. Power burst outward, and the demon's sword Gruhorn roared back to life, dragging ancient memories from the depths and revealing the true purpose it had carried for so long. Gruhorn's true form erupted into reality as a towering armored figure wrapped in a fierce red aura. This was not merely a blade made for battle, it was the essence of a heart forged to kill dragons, a living memory of the ultimate dragon slayer. Crimson energy surged over Adrian's face, swallowing his features in its glow. His eyes burned with the infernal power of the sword, as though Gruhorn's ancient will had poured directly into him. Adrian and the manifested sword were both swallowed by the memory of dragon slaying, their forms framed by the enormous shadow of a spectral dragon looming behind them. The sword's one and only purpose became brutally clear. It had been forged for slaughter, shaped for the act of killing, and now that ruthless power was flowing straight through Adrian. The true might of the dragon-slaying sword exploded inside Adrian, ancient strength surging through him like a legacy carved across generations of battle. That power, forged through countless dragon-slaying memories, now coursed through his veins, drawn forth by the blood of dragons itself. And then it appeared, the sword's terrifying true shape, a monstrous skeletal dragon head burning with crimson energy, its glowing eyes promising total destruction. The spectral beast grew solid and overwhelming, towering above him like a primal force given form. Adrian was completely swallowed by the sight before him, unable to look away from the impossible thing taking shape. All he could do was stare in disbelief as one desperate question slipped from his lips. What in the world was this? Taylor Talheim stood frozen after witnessing the impossible, his face drained with pure disbelief. Even the scarred swordsman, despite all his experience, shouted out in panic, throwing a desperate warning into the air against a force that had already begun moving beyond anyone's control. The warning came too late. Adrian's hand flared with the same violent crimson energy, and the transformation pushed forward even faster. His eyes burned a fiery red, his expression hardened into terrifying resolve, and the power closed around him as if it had fully taken hold. All at once, a desperate shout tore through the heavy silence, ringing out with urgent force. "Stop!" A sword hilt throbbed with a dangerous pink glow, its light pulsing like a warning sign. At the same time, Gruhorn released a dark twisting aura, and the raw power spilling from it made the air feel heavy. The voice cried out that the sword was dangerous, its warning sharp and frantic. But Gruhorn showed no fear, turning instead toward his uncle, and saying that before their spar began, there was something he needed to ask. Intrigued, Vale Balarhard looked back at him and asked what it was. Gruhorn's eyes flared to life, glowing with a terrifying red light. Then he made his request in a chillingly calm voice. If it ever looked like he was about to kill his opponent, then, before the weight of those words could fully settle, he burst into motion, his body coiled for a relentless attack. Gruhorn took his stance with silent intensity, every line of his posture challenging Vale Balarhard as the spar was about to begin. With a cold declaration, he challenged his uncle to stop him before things went too far. Vale Balarhard accepted without hesitation, his eyes blazing with intense blue light as a surging aura rose around him. Gruhorn was just as prepared, his own eyes burning crimson while menacing red energy curled around his body. Then the two forces collided in an explosive clash. Crimson and blue energy crashed together violently as Gruhorn's sword slammed straight into Vale Balarhard's blue-charged fist. Vale Balarhard did not give an inch. He stood firm beneath the impact, his resolve unshaken as the blue power around him pulsed even harder, and a thunderous quang ripped through the air. When the force finally settled, Vale Balarhard remained standing as the clear victor, having completely repelled the prince's furious assault with overwhelming strength. Counterattack was so powerful that Adrian was launched backward, skidding harshly across the ground. Shock flashed across his face as he struggled to process how completely he had been thrown off. The spar ended in a violent burst, and for a moment a ringing silence settled over the area. Only the metallic echo of a blade broke through the stunned stillness. A furious accusation cut through the tension as someone demanded to know what Count Balarhard had done. Adrian knelt on the ground in defeat, surrounded by knights, while Vale Balarhard stood over him. From the watching crowd, a panicked voice shouted that the commander would be punished for what had happened to Adrian. Vale Balarhard remained unmoved by the uproar around him. With a cold, steady voice, he cut through the chaos and ordered everyone to stand back, making it clear that Adrian had been the one who asked for this. Adrian was still reeling from the blow, his teeth clenched tight. As humiliation and anger churned behind his eyes, he forced the words out, admitting that he had asked Vale Balarhard to do it. But Vale Balarhard simply stared down at him and delivered the brutal truth. He had never said he would knock him out gently. A low primal growl tore from Adrian's throat, his eyes igniting crimson as raw power burst around him and his jaw tightened with barely restrained rage. A nearby knight stammered in terror, barely able to form the words as he addressed the prince. At the same moment, electric blue energy exploded into being, crackling wildly before gathering into a phantom, almost human shape, a vivid, living remnant of the overwhelming force Adrian had just faced. Adrian looked down at his hand, where a faint blue glow still lingered over his skin. As he studied it, he could not help thinking that his own magic had genuinely come close to cracking under that impact. The image of Vale Balarhard wrapped in that same powerful aura stayed burned into Adrian's mind. He understood now that his uncle's strength was on an entirely different level, far beyond any ordinary chain user. He clearly remembered taking that direct hit, the blue energy still swirling around his chest as he considered just how dangerous it had been. Fortunately, as he examined his glowing hand, there seemed to be no lasting side effects, but it had been far too close for comfort. A victorious grin slowly spread across Adrian's face as the soft blue light continued to radiate from his hand. Despite everything, he proudly declared that he had still won the duel in the end. From across the room, Vale Balarhard watched him with a doubtful look, unable to ignore that smug smile. At last, he asked Adrian why he was grinning so widely. Then the scarred swordsman stepped forward, his expression serious as he demanded to know what had brought them all the way there. At the same time, Adrian's uncle was still shaken, pressing him to explain what kind of absurd move he had just used. Adrian looked at the mysterious glow flowing from his hand and questioned the true nature of the unrighteous sword he had unleashed. Power still seemed to radiate from him, but Vale Balorhard refused to accept it calmly. With disbelief written across his stern face, he insisted that he had never taught Adrian anything like that. Adrian did not look shaken at all. Instead, he answered coolly, saying he had simply followed the true essence of the blade. His words carried complete confidence, and as he stared ahead with unwavering resolve burning in his eyes, he looked ready to face whatever came next. Vale Balorhard fell silent as Adrian's words sank in, his stern gaze lingering on the prince. Only a true warrior could understand the essence of a sword so directly, and that essence was not justice or honor, it was pure, merciless killing intent. A brilliant crimson flash burst across the space, flooding everything in red light as the power around Adrian flared again. It was raw, overwhelming, and almost unreal, the kind of force that could steal a person's breath while pulling them in at the same time. Vale Balorhard's expression finally cracked, his face twisting with open astonishment. Even he, a man who had seen countless battles, looked completely shaken by how far Adrian had changed in such a short time. Adrian himself seemed caught off guard by the result, his eyes lowering slightly, as if he was trying to understand what had just awakened inside him. For once, his usual confidence gave way to quiet thought. Vale Balorhard had been prepared to lecture his nephew about the true path of the sword, to hammer some hard-earned wisdom into him, but after seeing that impossible display, even his words had been knocked clean out of him. In the end, the veteran warrior had to admit the truth plainly. He was a soldier, not a scholar who could dress things up with clever explanations. Concepts that deep were beyond him. What he understood was victory, and if winning required throwing away the idea of righteousness, then that was simply the path he would take. Adrian answered with perfect calm, as if the explanation were the most natural thing in the world. The one who had taught him was not a person at all. It was the sword itself. Vale Balorhard's face remained hard and unreadable as he gave his warning. That kind of killing intent was dangerous, a trap disguised as strength, and if Adrian let his guard down for even a moment, it could swallow him completely. Adrian let a small, knowing smirk tug at the corner of his mouth, clearly absorbing every word without looking frightened. Then he threw the warning right back at his uncle, asking if all this seriousness meant Vale Balorhard was trying to fix him. Vale Balorhard's eyes narrowed, his stare sharpening with quiet pressure. He made it clear that from now on, he would be watching closely to see whether Adrian would be consumed by that power or whether the strength inside him would prove stronger than the blade's hunger. 3 days passed in a blur of brutal practice duels, each one pushing both men to their limits. By the end, with his blade still giving off a faint hum of power, Taylor Talheim looked at Adrian and asked for his name once more, as if he needed to confirm it with his own ears. Adrian stood with his usual composed silence, his posture calm and steady. The sword in his hand seemed less like a weapon he carried and more like an extension of his own will. Then, for a rare moment, a faint smile softened Adrian's expression. He looked at Taylor Talheim and offered a simple but meaningful acknowledgement, telling him that he had done well over the past 3 days. For 3 straight days, Taylor Talheim had been forced to stand against a sword that radiated nothing but killing intent. Every clash had meant facing that pressure head-on, with the blade's murderous presence bearing down on him again and again. Taylor Talheim was clearly impressed, but there was a trace of frustration mixed into his expression. After everything they had gone through, he could only mutter that it was a shame. Then he added a playful jab saying Adrian would have taken the victory outright if he had managed to beat him even once. But the truth was simple. Adrian had not been able to knock him down. Taylor Talheim paused for a moment, his tone shifting from teasing to respectful. With a small nod, he told Adrian to bring it over. He then revealed a magnificent treasure chest, its polished surface and reinforced edges making it clear this was no ordinary box. Addressing Adrian as Your Highness, Taylor Talheim declared that he would accept it. After their intense duels, Taylor Talheim faced Adrian with a more serious expression, clearly thinking back on what had happened before. Holding out the intricate wooden chest bound with metal, he asked whether this offering would be enough to make amends, his uncertainty showing as he wondered if it could truly compensate for the past. Then Taylor Talheim told Adrian to take the chest to Baron Talheim instead. Its contents, he explained, were nothing extravagant beyond a measure of gold and silver. With the chest now in his hands, Adrian turned to leave. Behind him, Taylor Talheim offered one final farewell, wishing him a safe journey. As Adrian left the castle behind, he thought quietly about the situation. He knew he was not obligated to clean up problems created by other people, and yet a soft thank you still slipped from him. Restoring someone's dignity always came with a price, and now that his commander's practiced duels had become the talk of the kingdom, that price was impossible to ignore. Elsewhere, inside a breathtaking palace filled with grandeur and cold elegance, an unseen voice reflected on the past. They admitted that their own arrogance had gone too far, and that they had once acted as freely as if nothing could restrain them. High above, On a towering balcony overlooking the palace grounds, a man and woman stood side by side. The woman's voice carried a chilling edge as she wondered how much more Adrian was destined to suffer. Even after days of waiting, the news everyone expected never truly broke. When the subject finally came up, Taylor Talheim got straight to the point and asked if Adrian was talking about the duel. With a faint smirk, Adrian pointed out the new title attached to his companion and acknowledged the result being discussed, the first prince's defeat at the hands of the double-chain knight, but he quickly made it clear that both sides had fought with everything they had and that his purpose had never been to threaten anyone. What he wanted was to test the first prince's sincerity. In another place, 3 nobles were left staring in complete shock. One of them could barely breathe out a gasp, stunned by what they had just heard. They whispered among themselves, trying to understand what was going on. If the royal family had buried the story, then the person involved must have been furious. A fist clenched in rage, and one noble suddenly roared, demanding to know why they were talking about him. The portly noble was practically shaking with anger, his face twisted in irritation. In his mind, the answer was obvious. The first prince was simply too ashamed to admit that he had lost. When Adrian heard the petty rumors spreading, he could only scoff in disbelief. These nobles, he thought, truly needed to find something better to do than gossip. Then his gaze sharpened, settling firmly on the knight before him. A low, guttural sound rumbled from Adrian's throat as his expression hardened. The air around him seemed to tighten as he prepared to give his order. When the knight headed out, Adrian told him to make absolutely certain that the results of the duel were spread properly. The knight immediately snapped to attention, bowed low, and answered that he would do exactly as commanded. Later, Adrian stood with his arms crossed, his brow slightly furrowed as the thought kept bothering him. Surely now that the truth had been sent out, the rumors would finally start to die down. But a flicker of unease crossed his face, subtle yet impossible to miss. Something about the situation still did not feel settled. Just then, a maid rushed in with alarming news. According to the newest rumor, His Highness had supposedly threatened his opponent into faking the results of the duel. Adrian's face sank into shadow, hiding his expression from view. Whatever he was feeling in that moment, he did not let it show clearly. Frustration burned inside Adrian, but he forced himself to push past the sting of his earlier losses. Instead of wasting more time on rumors, he decided there was only one thing to do: train and grow stronger. With that resolve, explosive blue energy surged from him, crackling through the air. Adrian launched himself into motion, moving so fast that a blazing trail of azure light streamed behind him. His body cut across the space like a flash of power given form. The energy around him swelled even further, pulsing with a deep, heavy hum that vibrated through the air. Every beat of that power felt dense and alive. He kept driving forward at a blistering pace, each movement sharper than the last. With every step and swing, more of that incredible blue energy burst outward around him. Then Adrian unleashed a devastating sweep, and a massive arc of energy tore through the air. The blue wave exploded outward with enough force to leave the space trembling in its wake. And then, almost as suddenly as it had surged to life, the raw energy began to fade. Only the lingering pressure of that power remained, hanging faintly in the air. A perfectly formed sphere of raw power glowed in Adrian's hand, steady and intense. Staring at it with fierce determination, he swore that he would not lose again. Later, with Taylor Talheim standing beside him, Adrian asked about the remaining duels. Taylor Talheim answered that the opponent coming today would be the last one. Adrian had clearly grown stronger by then, and he knew it himself. At this point, ordinary apprentice knights were no longer enough to match him. Still, he had not forgotten the final opponent waiting ahead. This last challenger was no mere trainee, but a swordmaster, a true knight who had refined the blade to an entirely different level. This was the kind of knight who had never been satisfied with basic swordsmanship. A genuine prodigy. She had entered a knighthood not for comfort or status, but to push herself harder and sharpen her limits. Her name was Arwen Kurgayan, a probationary knight of the Iron Lion Knights, and even that title carried the weight of someone far from ordinary. And then she appeared, standing inside the opulent hall with a presence that immediately demanded attention. Power seemed to radiate from her calm, formidable figure. Adrian's eyes narrowed as he recognized her at once. The emblem of the Iron Lion Knights gleamed unmistakably on her armor, confirming that the final opponent had truly arrived. Among the knights, Arwen Kurgayan was known by a name that sounded beautiful and dangerous at the same time: the Flower of the Cliff. Like a rose blooming on a sheer rock face, she was admired from afar, feared up close, and remembered as the legendary knight who had broken the hearts of every man foolish enough to approach her. Two powerful figures stood watching in silence, their very presence enough to dominate the hall. Neither of them needed to move or raise their voices. The weight they carried filled the space as they took in the sight before them. Vale Balarhard, the double-chain knight, stared at the unexpected arrival and let out a low comment, unable to hide his disbelief. To think that a woman of Arwen Kurgayan's caliber had come all the way here of her own will, there was something almost absurdly bold about it. Then, with a faint trace of admiration in his voice, Vale Balarhard added that in a strange way, The prince truly did have an impressive talent. Somehow, Adrian had drawn even someone like her into his orbit, and there she stood. Arwen Kurgayan herself, the so-called Thorny Rose. Her gaze was sharp and unwavering, her posture still and controlled, yet the pressure radiating from her made it clear she was no delicate flower, fully prepared for battle. Arwen Kurgayan looked almost unreal, wrapped in an aura of raw strength that seemed to shimmer around her armor. Watching her, Vale Balarhard gave a sharp challenging remark, wondering how amusing it would be if the prince ended up humiliated by that woman. Speaking of the Iron Lion Knights, Vale Balarhard could not help emphasizing their reputation. They were famous for overwhelming strength, and even among people like that, Adrian was a prodigy who stood out in a way that could not be ignored. And among their rising talents was Arwen Kurgayan, a probationary knight who had already proven her worth. Even before her formal position was fully secured, her skill had made it clear that she belonged among the Iron Lion Knights. But Adrian's thoughts were caught somewhere else entirely. He could not understand why a genius like Arwen Kurgayan would go out of her way to duel him. Seeing his confusion, his attendant quickly stepped in, trying to soften the matter by saying there had only been a slight misunderstanding in the past involving Sir Arwen. Adrian scoffed at that explanation immediately. In his eyes there was no chance someone like her would draw a sword without a reason, and he flatly rejected the idea that it could be brushed off as a simple misunderstanding. Then Adrian turned the pressure back onto his attendant, his stare sharpening. If there had been something between him and Arwen Kurgayan in the past, then he wanted to know exactly what had happened. The attendant froze under that stare, his mouth opening and closing without a proper answer. No matter how hard he tried, the words refused to come out cleanly. Inside his mind, the memory returned with painful clarity. The only thought he could form was that Adrian had harassed Sir Arwen. A strained gasp slipped from the attendant before he could stop it. The memory was so outrageous that even breathing normally became difficult. As the full weight of Adrian's past behavior crashed back into him, the attendant could only scream inwardly. In his heart, he cursed the prince as an unbelievable madman. The memory flashed back clearly. Adrian, wearing an arrogant smirk, had looked at her and asked if her name was Arwen. Then, without hesitation, he had gone even further, saying that she really was as pretty as the rumors claimed, and asking whether she would like to become his personal maid. When the attendant returned to the present, the anger from that memory was still burning inside him, but all he managed to force out through clenched restraint was a strained address to the prince. Deep down, his fury was exploding. The Iron Lion Knights were not Adrian's private possessions, and someone like Arwen Kurgayan was certainly not a person he could casually treat as his own. Unable to say it aloud, the attendant could only curse Adrian in his head, calling him an ugly, shameless thing. Vale Balarhard stated it plainly, his tone steady and unshaken. That at least was what he had heard Adrian said back then. Adrian shot back without missing a beat, saying that only someone who had never seen a truly beautiful woman would speak that way. After all, there was no way anyone could look at Arwen Kurgayan and honestly call her ugly. Vale Balarhard stood there in his dark armor, like an immovable wall, his presence heavy and intimidating. A faint smile touched his lips, but there was something cold enough in it to send a chill through the air. Adrian addressed him with calm familiarity, saying it had been a long time, Your Highness. Then he added that Vale Balarhard had not changed at all, but beneath those words, Adrian's expression tightened with distaste. The person standing there may have looked the same, yet something about the one inside felt completely different. In an instant, Vale Balarhard's eyes ignited with fierce yellow energy. He said nothing, but the blazing look alone carried the force of a challenge about to explode. Adrian slumped slightly, as if finally accepting the absurdity of his situation, and muttered that this must all be his karma. Then the attendant's booming voice rang through the hall, announcing Count Balarhard's arrival as Vale Balarhard made his grand entrance. Vale Balarhard's intense gaze locked straight onto Adrian, sharp and unblinking. No words were needed. The challenge in his stare was clear enough. Adrian did not flinch under that pressure. He met the gaze calmly, recognizing the arrival of the new Iron Lion Knight with a composed expression. Then Arwen Kurgayan stepped forward, her movements crisp and controlled. With the proper formality of a knight, she offered her own sharp greeting to Count Balarhard. The arena settled into tense silence, every eye drawn toward the fighters. Then the declaration rang out, clear and final. The duel would begin. From the darkness at the edge of the arena, a cloaked warrior emerged with a blade already in hand. Their posture was low and ready, every part of them poised for battle. Adrian watched closely, his interest sharpening. As someone who never missed a warrior's movements, he was eager to see what kind of skill this promising knight of the Iron Lion Knights could display. Without warning, the cloaked figure burst forward. One moment they were standing still, and the next they were a streak of motion tearing across the arena at terrifying speed. Adrian's eyes flared electric blue as he followed every movement. Even at that impossible pace, his gaze locked onto the fighter's hyperspeed maneuvers without letting a single motion slip past him. A blast of raw blue energy erupted from the strike, bursting outward in a violent flash. The attack landed cleanly, smashing into Vale Balorhard with brutal, lightning-fast force. Vale Balorhard was sent flying backward, overwhelmed before he could fully respond. The speed was so unnatural that it felt as though the attacker had slipped through the flow of movement itself. He barely had time to recover from the first blow before the cloaked figure closed in again. A sword flashed from beneath the cloak, already angled to deliver another devastating attack. There was no room to breathe. The next strike came in like lightning, crashing into Vale Balorhard and shaking him to his core. And before he could regain his balance, a brutal kick connected with his body. The impact sent him flying again, completely breaking his stance. The sword dropped in a blur, and Vale Balorhard only barely managed to raise his arm in time to block it. The force of the blow rattled through him, shaking him down to the bone, and then a crushing kick to the chest hurled him back, leaving him breathless and exposed. Watching from the side, Adrian could hardly believe what he was seeing. The mysterious fighter's power and speed were so far beyond expectation that his shock slipped out before he could contain it. But the battle was nowhere near finished. As Vale Balorhard struggled to rise, the cloaked figure's eyes suddenly burned with fierce blue light, and a powerful aura erupted around their body. That blue energy changed in an instant, twisting and exploding into terrifying crimson power. The red force crackled violently as it gathered around the fighter's leg, and a blazing message appeared before Adrian's eyes. Dragonslayer's heart had been activated. The fighter's eye now burned with a fierce crimson glow, bright enough to make the air feel dangerous. That single flash signaled the awakening of a new and terrifying power. He unleashed a merciless storm of red-tinged slashes, forcing Vale Balorhard to recoil again and again beneath the relentless assault. The sword in his hand hummed with cold blue energy, and its strange, frightening nature was now fully revealing itself. Another heavy blow landed with a resounding impact, the force brutal enough to make it feel as if bone itself might crack. Vale Balorhard was driven even farther back, his body reeling under the pressure. The assailant moved with deadly, fluid grace, his body becoming a blur wrapped in streaks of crimson energy. Without giving Vale Balorhard a chance to recover, he pressed the advantage with ruthless precision. From a distance, Arwen Kurgayan watched the duel unfold without looking away. Her eyes were fixed entirely on the assailant's weapon, studying it with sharp, focused intensity. Adrian, taking in the overwhelming display before him, understood immediately that this swordsman was operating on a level completely different from anyone he had faced before. This was not ordinary skill, it was something far more dangerous. Adrian's own eye began to glow with blue light as another message appeared before him. It revealed that the authority of judgment could only be used under limited conditions, making the timing of that power even more critical. The truth behind the attacker came out like a blade pulled from its sheath, and it was far more shocking than anyone expected. She had once been a female apprentice knight, and now she rushed forward with killing intent, her sword wrapped in a sinister blue glow. That weapon was no ordinary blade either. It was Taylor Talheim's legendary sword, burning in her hands as she charged straight at Adrian Leonberg. Just seeing her hold that sword was enough to make Adrian's expression twist with contempt, even if she could only draw out a sliver of its real strength. The fact that she could touch the blade at all made him scoff coldly, as if the sight itself offended him. Then Adrian's eyes flared a deep, violent crimson. A blazing red aura burst around his body like fire-given form, surging higher and sharper as he prepared himself for the clash that was about to decide everything. The attacker moved first, vanishing into a blur as her glowing sword sliced through the air like a streak of blue death. Adrian watched every angle of her strike, reading the flow of her power in an instant, and he quickly understood that what she wielded was nothing compared to him, only a tiny fragment of the strength he truly possessed. The next moment, metal crashed against metal with a shriek that rang across the battlefield. Adrian met the incoming blow head-on, stopping her blade before it could bite any deeper. Wrapped in a furious surge of red energy, she let out a roar, and the real battle erupted at last. Their blades slammed together with explosive force, crimson and blue power bursting outward in a wild storm. The shockwave snapped through the air like lightning, ripping apart the space between them with every collision. Adrian was already driving himself far beyond comfort, sweat running down his face as he fought to keep breathing. Every gasp tore through his chest, his lungs burning with each ragged breath, but he kept grinding through the brutal training without letting his sword hand fall. Even when his body begged him to stop, Adrian refused to surrender. He stayed on his feet, forcing himself forward through sheer stubborn will. His sword flashed out in a clean, decisive arc, moving so fast it became nothing but intent and motion, aimed straight for the training dummy in front of him. But right before the strike could land, a sharp voice cut through the air and shattered his focus. Adrian froze mid-swing, the tension snapping tight around him in an instant. Taylor Talheim, who had been watching him with a careful eye, stepped in with firm authority. "Stop. That's enough for today. We'll continue tomorrow." Adrian, still breathing hard and struggling to steady himself, immediately snapped back in disbelief. "Tomorrow? I was right there. I was literally about to finish it." Taylor only looked at him in silence for a moment, his brow tightening into the faintest frown. That small change in his expression made it clear he was not impressed. Then he spoke plainly, without softening the blow at all. "There's no point pushing further when you're still this weak." A powerful voice suddenly tore through the silence, shouting, "Enough!" The command hit the air so sharply it felt as if even time itself had been ordered to stop, but the words that followed carried an even heavier weight, echoing with finality. It was already too late. Adrian, down on his knees, still dared to challenge her authority, demanding to know why she had the right to act so privileged. She fired back without hesitation, making it clear that his orders were not the end of everything. Only then did Adrian notice the fresh bruise on his body. A dark mark left behind by the relentless strain he had forced himself through. He raised a glowing green orb in his hand, its light pulsing quietly between his fingers, as if he were offering a silent challenge instead of another argument. Her eyes narrowed as she looked at him, her gaze sharp and cold. Without saying a word, she seemed to weigh him, judge him, and find exactly what she expected. For a moment, neither of them moved. The space between them grew tense, charged with stubborn pride and clashing wills. Then she simply turned her back and walked away, leaving Adrian behind without another word. But each step she took carried a hotter flame inside her heart, and that silent vow burned brighter than ever. She would absolutely not lose. Beneath a vast golden sky, the towering walls of the fortress stood in solemn silence. In the wide courtyard below, two figures looked almost small against that massive stone backdrop as they prepared to face each other. Adrian studied his opponent from across the grounds, quietly hoping that today's match would end without a clear winner. He found himself wondering if this was really their third duel already, and the strange turn of events surprised him more than he expected. He had heard the rumors about her swordsmanship, and knew people called her frighteningly skilled. Still, the first prince's own ability was impressive enough that even those rumors no longer felt one-sided. Across the arena, the former apprentice knight stared back at him without wavering. In her heart, she hoped today would finally bring a decisive result. Both of them held their positions, their weapons ready, with a sword tip resting near Adrian's armored foot as the air grew thick with anticipation. Before the duel could truly continue, Adrian lifted one hand and stopped the moment from moving forward. His voice came out calm but firm as he declared that there was something important he needed to say. The former apprentice knight looked straight at him, her expression tightening as suspicion hardened across her face. She asked if he was trying to apologize only now, right before their blades crossed again. Her eyes blazed with a fierce red light as she made her answer clear before he could even continue. Whatever apology he might offer, she had no intention of accepting it. With those burning red eyes fixed on him, her desire was obvious. She wanted to reclaim her pride through strength alone. And while that resolve was admirable, it might not be enough to reach the result she wanted. Adrian, always thinking several steps ahead, suddenly changed the shape of the duel with one bold proposal. He suggested a dangerous wager. Whoever lost would grant the winner one wish. He held her gaze, waiting to see how she would react to the gamble he had just placed between them. But she refused to back away, declaring fiercely that no matter what order was given, she would never kneel or bow. Her face remained as hard as stone, every line of her expression carrying the same wordless declaration. Her will would not bend. Suddenly, an attendant at the sidelines could no longer stay silent and cut in with alarm, warning Adrian that a royal could not speak so recklessly. He demanded that Adrian take back his words, only to snap at the outsiders nearby as well, questioning why they were even interfering in the first place. Adrian brushed off the attendant's outburst without much concern and turned his attention toward Arwen Kirgayan instead. With an almost casual tone, he asked what she thought about the matter. Even after rejecting the wager, the former apprentice knight revealed something that stunned everyone nearby. She, too, was a knight of the Leonberg royal family. Hearing that unexpected truth, Vale Ballarhard immediately reaffirmed his loyalty, declaring that he would never show disrespect toward His Highness. Adrian's lips curved into a confident smirk as he answered that, if His Highness allowed it, then he was ready to proceed. He pressed the point even further, making it clear he was already thinking about what he would claim if he won the wager. Vale Ballarhard gave a firm nod, standing fully behind his lord's judgment. His approval was steady, as though he believed Adrian's thinking was perfectly sound. Adrian then sealed the terms with a forceful declaration, making it clear that neither side would be allowed to go back on their word later. With the agreement locked in, Arwen Kirgan shifted into a battle-ready stance, her sword gleaming while fierce determination burned in her eyes. Adrian matched her intensity at once, drawing his own sword with the calm confidence of someone inviting the challenge. Facing him, the former apprentice knight fixed her glowing red eyes on her rival and steadied her weapon, ready for the violent clash that was about to erupt. Arwen exploded forward without warning, her sword cutting through the air as a lightning-fast streak of blue. Her attack crashed into Adrian's defense with enough force to make the entire exchange feel desperate from the first blow. But instead of fear, a dangerous smirk tugged at Adrian's lips. His eyes flared with a hellish crimson light, as if the battle had finally become interesting. A devastating wave of red power burst from him and slammed into his opponent, blasting her backward. The raw force tore through the air, making the space around them tremble from the violence of the impact. Arwen was left utterly speechless, her eyes widening as she tried to process the impossible speed Adrian had just revealed. Vale could only stare in stunned silence as a spectral red dragon seemed to take shape around the first prince. A chilling thought rose in his mind. Had Adrian been hiding his true strength this entire time? Then, with one final overwhelming strike, Adrian seized complete control of the duel and crushed his opponent's momentum entirely. The impact came in an instant, too fast and too powerful to resist. With a single explosive blow, Adrian shattered the enemy's sword into countless fragments, and the apprentice knight was hurled backward, her body unable to withstand the brutal force released against her. Her face twisted with terror and pain as the terrifying red energy swallowed her whole, wrapping around her like a storm she could not escape. Adrian disappeared from sight and reappeared in a flash, his crimson aura burning even brighter as he unleashed another devastating strike. A desperate scream ripped from her throat as the overwhelming power crashed down on her, threatening to tear her body apart under the sheer weight of Adrian's strength. The crimson power detonated with terrifying force, bursting outward in a furious wave that felt less like an attack and more like pure destruction compressed into a single strike. Adrian's eyes burned like hellfire as he drove the battle toward its end. Raw, untamed power crackled around his hand, twisting the air around his fingers until his entire arm looked like a weapon made for obliteration. The apprentice knight collapsed hard against the ground, completely overwhelmed, while the last traces of red energy began to fade around her. But Adrian did not give her even a breath of space. He closed the distance in a blur, his crimson-tinted force surging forward all over again. The next impact tore through everything in its path. Stone, dust, and air itself seemed to burst apart, swallowed by a violent bloom of crimson energy. The force sent the former apprentice knight flying backward like a broken doll, her body slamming into a distant wall with a brutal crash. When the dust finally began to settle, Adrian stood alone in the courtyard, the red aura around him slowly thinning into the air. He walked toward the defeated figure lying motionless on the ground, the outcome already clear to everyone watching. From farther away, the onlookers stared at the result in stunned silence. Their faces carried both awe and worry, as if they had just witnessed something far beyond an ordinary duel. Vale Balorhard's brow tightened as he looked on, his sharp gaze fixed on Adrian. He was still trying to process the overwhelming power that had just erupted before his eyes. Arwen Kurgian, standing off to the side, could only watch with visible unease. Surprise flickered across her face, mixed with the kind of concern that could not be hidden. Adrian looked down at his fallen opponent and spoke as if the matter had been settled from the very beginning. "I won the bet." As the victor, Adrian stood over the former apprentice knight, his shadow falling across her defeated body on the cold ground. She had challenged him with everything she had, and still, she had been crushed. A confident smirk spread across Adrian's face, carrying more than a little arrogance. The wager was his now, and he knew exactly what that meant. But from the sidelines, Arwen Kurgian did not look relieved at all. Her expression tightened with worry as she watched the scene unfold before her. A new royal guard came forward to serve Adrian Leonberg, the infamous first prince whose reputation had already spread far and wide. Standing face to face with him, the guard received Adrian's blunt question. "You're the new royal guard?" Vale Balorhard answered with a sharp, respectful nod. "Yes, I look forward to serving you, Your Highness." Adrian gave only a short nod in return and said, "Right, I'll be counting on you." And that alone was enough to surprise everyone, because the prince had not dismissed him coldly the way they all expected. With that brief exchange finished, Adrian turned and strode away. His footsteps carried a firm, commanding rhythm as he left the others behind. At first glance, Adrian might have looked arrogant, distant, and impossible to approach. But the truth beneath that attitude was something else entirely. Rain suddenly poured from the sky, drenching the entire castle in a heavy gray curtain. Beneath the downpour, Vale Balorhard stood alone, watching the storm crash over the grounds. The rain only grew stronger, hammering rooftops, stone walls, and armor without mercy. Nearby, the attendant looked visibly strained and asked whether they should really continue under conditions like this, worry for His Highness clear in his voice. Then a sinister call cut through the roar of the storm, followed by one chilling command. Now, in the same instant, panic exploded across Adrian's face as a frantic warning rang out for His Highness to be careful. Before anyone had time to react, Vale Balorhard was already in motion. A blinding surge of power flashed through the rain as he deflected the incoming danger, moving like a crimson inferno as he forced the attack back. Adrian could only stare, rain plastering his hair against his face as he took in the raw power before him. Vale's eyes never left the threat, his posture steady and unshaken, because he had seen this danger coming from far away. Standing tall in the relentless rain, he remembered how firmly he had once believed His Highness was destined for greatness, yet now that conviction felt painfully distant. Later, Prince Adrian stood tall upon the ramparts, his appearance changed and his presence sharper than before. Beside him was a young apprentice knight, and the air between them tightened just before Adrian fixed his powerful gaze on her and said, "I want you." The apprentice knight froze as if the words had struck her directly. A shocked gasp escaped her lips, her thoughts scrambling so wildly that she could barely speak before stammering, "H, how scandalous." Adrian watched her reaction closely, reading every twitch of surprise on her face. For a brief moment, a doubtful thought crossed his mind. Had he misjudged her completely? But the tension did not end there. The former apprentice knight, her red eyes glowing with fierce intensity, had heard Adrian's words as well, and disbelief slipped from her in a sharp gasp. She stepped into the moment without wasting a second, her voice cutting through the air with a clear challenge. "Is that truly what your highness desires?" Adrian did not flinch. He met her gaze directly and answered with cold certainty, "Of course, as you are now." Then he delivered his judgment without mercy, telling her that at present she was nothing more than an ordinary apprentice knight who could not even defeat a goblin's thrall. But Adrian's true intention was not to claim just any knight. With that piercing look in his eyes, he revealed what he really wanted: the overwhelming future potential of the legendary knight, Arwen Kurgayan. Even in that moment, Arwen's presence could not be ignored. There was strength in the way she stood, a pressure around her that made it clear she was no ordinary fighter. Adrian stared forward with unwavering resolve, his decision already made. What he needed was simple and absolute. "I need a knight who follows me." Vale Balorhard bristled at those words and answered with sharp agitation to him. A true knight was not some disposable piece to be moved around at will, but a person of genuine worth, someone who belonged only to the lord they chose to serve. Adrian looked over the knights before him, measuring their worth in silence. His thoughts moved quickly, weighing their talent, their presence, and what each of them might become. Before Adrian's eyes, Arwen's abilities stood out with absurd clarity: swordsmanship at an exceptional level, archery far above average, and mana sensitivity so high it was almost frightening. On top of that, her nature revealed a sword prodigy with a fierce competitive spirit, a soft heart, and a pure core that made her talent shine even brighter. That was why Adrian's conclusion did not waver. The one he had chosen was Arwen Kurgayan. Then Adrian gave her the challenge directly, his words landing with the weight of an order. "Become my knight." The command struck the young woman in dark armor, cutting straight through the noise around them. It was the dream she had chased her entire life. She had finally become the kind of knight she once longed to be, but the reality was nothing like the shining image she had imagined. In battle, she moved like a storm of steel, tearing through enemies with her brutal scythe-like weapon while whispers spread through the crowd. "Is that the kid?" Yeah, the rumors were true. Behind her fierce gaze and dark, flowing hair was a life filled with struggle. No matter how strong she became, and no matter how much power she showed, people still refused to see her as a real knight. So she pushed herself harder than everyone else, training twice as much, enduring twice as much, and forcing her way past every wall through nothing but raw determination. Now her weapon burned with a strange, otherworldly light, shining like proof of every grueling hour she had poured into her strength and every limit she had broken. She moved with lightning speed, her blade becoming a blur as it knocked her opponent's weapon away. A heartbeat later, he was crashing to the ground, completely overwhelmed by her strike. The announcement rang out across the arena with undeniable finality. Winner, Arwen Kurgayan. And even after she had defeated every apprentice who stood against her, her skill remained impossible to deny. When another attack came, she turned it aside with effortless precision. Her sword met the incoming blade with a sharp metallic ring, the sound snapping through the air like a declaration of her strength. Again and again she produced results no one could ignore, proving her ability with every battle she survived and every opponent she brought down. And still, the hateful words never stopped echoing in her mind. "Don't you dare call yourself a knight? Who could you protect when you're that weak? You're no knight." No matter how hard she fought, the title she wanted most kept slipping out of reach. Now, Adrian's offer left her shaken in a completely different way. A blush crept across her face as his armored hand reached out toward her, and doubt tangled with hope inside her chest. Was he truly recognizing her skill? Or was he only seeing her as a woman? Adrian's expression remained serious, without even a hint of teasing. And that only made the question hit harder in her mind. Was he really being sincere? In the vast courtyard, with Adrian's companions watching from nearby, the moment stretched thin and heavy. The prince stood before her and asked for only one thing. She answered by setting her condition clearly. If he wanted her at his side, then he had to treat her not as a woman to be protected, but as a true knight. The word knight rang through Arwen Kurgayan's mind like a bell she had been waiting her whole life to hear. Adrian's armored hand clenched firmly, and with that single gesture, he accepted her condition completely. His eyes stayed sharp, steady, and unshaken as they met hers head-on, leaving no room for doubt or hesitation. Then Adrian gave his answer in a clear, decisive voice. "Fine, I promise." Arwen moved almost instantly, so swift and quiet that the motion seemed to cut through the heavy silence around them. In the next moment, she was down on one knee before him, her armor giving a soft metallic clink as she lowered her head and pledged her loyalty. Elsewhere in the Grand Hall, Vincent Balerhard, eldest son of the powerful Balerhard family, stepped forward with solemn resolve. Before everyone gathered there, he declared, "I swear loyalty to Prince Adrian Leonberg." His voice carried clearly through the hall as he continued, offering not only his sword but the rest of his life to his highness. Determination settled across Vincent's face, sharpening his features and making his vow feel even heavier. His blade pointed toward the floor like a symbol of unshakable commitment, sealing his claim as a true knight of Leonberg. With Vincent kneeling before him, Adrian Leonberg's voice rang out with royal authority. "Rise! In the name of Adrian Leonberg, I dub thee a knight. Be brave." Then he continued, commanding him to be courteous and loyal. The prince's final command echoed through the hall with quiet force. "And be loyal." When the ceremony ended, Vincent rose to his feet as an official knight. But nearby, the attendant watched in silence, his eyes dark with thoughts he did not speak aloud. In his mind, one fact kept circling back. Arwen Kiergaon had only become a knight yesterday, and as an orphan with no family to support her, she had been in no position to refuse their help. His brow tightened as suspicion crept into his gaze. From everything he had heard, something about this situation felt wrong. Why had Arwen joined the prince so suddenly? Was there some hidden reason behind it? Could Adrian be using her as a mistress, or perhaps as some kind of convenient cover? The more he thought about it, the stranger it seemed that someone who had only been training under a subordinate knight had risen so quickly. Adrian, meanwhile, was left completely rattled by the direction those thoughts had taken. For one horrible moment, he wondered if he had somehow ended up looking like the villain. Seeing the prince struggling with that realization, the attendant cut in with a ruthless comment. "Isn't that basically the worst kind of scum on earth?" His face remained perfectly cold as he said it, unreadable enough that no one could tell how serious he truly was. Then he turned toward Adrian with a grave look and said, "Your Highness." Adrian blinked back at him, caught off guard. "Huh?" The attendant did not stop there. He pressed forward, bringing up an old matter that Adrian had clearly hoped would stay buried. The memory of the final duel flashed through Adrian's mind, his own words ringing out as he declared that he was no knight who would break royal orders. The recollection struck him so hard that his eyes widened in alarm. Back in the present, the attendant kept pushing, reminding Adrian that a royal decree was not something he could simply ignore. Then, as if driving the blade in deeper, he pointed out that Adrian could always break the oath later if he wanted to act like a fool. Adrian fell silent, turning the challenge over in his mind, and wondered whether they would even accept such an oath if he tried to make one. But he rejected the idea almost immediately, making it clear he wanted nothing to do with it. There was no pleasure at all in the thought of that kind of marriage. When the attendant let out a small chuckle, Adrian narrowed his eyes, wondering if his serious tone was being taken seriously at all. So Adrian doubled down, his voice firm as he insisted that he meant every word. Then, out of nowhere, Adrian found himself holding an official document with news he had not expected. Adrian Leonberg was being released from probation and ordered to attend a royal banquet. He stared at the words, baffled, and could only wonder what he had done to cause this. He could hardly believe it. His probation had been lifted a full month and a half earlier than planned. A memory of the King of Leonberg flashed through his mind, the king looking so utterly disappointed that it had seemed as though Adrian would be confined forever. Back inside the first prince's palace, Adrian sat trapped in his own thoughts again, completely unable to understand his father's unpredictable decisions. The silence was suddenly broken by a growl from Adrian's stomach. Almost at the same time, his attendant appeared and asked whether His Highness was pleased that his probation had finally come to an end. Adrian only shrugged it off, acting as if the whole thing barely mattered to him. After all, who was he supposed to spend time with? Inside the palace, Adrian was practically alone, with hardly anyone he could casually meet. The attendant gave a quick, awkward cough and then revealed the next piece of news. An invitation had just arrived for the prince. Adrian looked up, his expression sharpening slightly. An invitation? The attendant confirmed it at once, pointing directly to the elegant seal stamped onto the letter. Adrian snatched up the letter, his eyes widening as he began scanning the words written across the page. It turned out to be an invitation to a royal social gathering, but the worst part was that attendance was not optional. He was expected to appear whether he wanted to or not. With his probation suddenly lifted, Adrian's thoughts began racing again. Was this the result of his recent success, or had it all just been some strange accident? Either way, he was far from celebrating. From the sidelines, Vincent and Arwen watched the situation unfold. Vincent could only find the whole thing incomprehensible, while Adrian was struck with yet another royal order he had no convenient way to avoid. Adrian read through the paper again and confirmed it for himself. It was a royal invitation to a high society gathering, the kind of mandatory mixer he could not simply skip. In his head, he was already complaining that he had far too much training to do to waste time at some useless social event. Then one name written on the invitation caught his eye, and the moment he saw it, the irritation drained from his face. Sender was Bernardo of the Eli family, and that signature immediately revealed who had arranged the invitation. Adrian's expression turned serious at once, because that name was not unfamiliar to him. He remembered the stories his uncle had told him about the Eli family, the ones who had pushed the study of the Manhwa until the bitter end. But centuries ago, their efforts had ended in ruin. In his mind, a mesmerizing swirl of electric blue energy seemed to pulse, carrying the weight of ancient power and old failure. After a moment, Adrian gave a decisive nod. "I suppose I should attend after all." His attendant responded immediately and respectfully, saying he understood and would prepare everything. A thoughtful look settled over Adrian's face as he stared down at the invitation. Quietly, he hoped the Eli family had not fallen completely from grace just yet. 4 months had passed since Adrian took over the first prince's body, and in that time, he had trained relentlessly to cut away the excess weight that had once held him back. Now, his careful attendant presented a new outfit before him, eagerly waiting for His Highness's approval. Adrian examined the clothing and noted that the tailor had followed his instructions properly, especially the choice of black. Even the decorations had been kept to the bare minimum, just as he had requested. The attendant practically glowed with pride as he confirmed that His Highness seemed pleased. Looking at his reflection, Adrian could not hide his satisfaction with how dramatically his body had changed. The attendant excitedly reported that his measurements had dropped by more than half, and Adrian, pleased with the result, decided to entrust him with the outfit for the palace banquet as well. The attendant's eyes lit up with determination, and he vowed to begin the preparations immediately. But Adrian, still in the middle of reshaping his body, told him to wait just a little longer. His physique had not finished changing yet, and he knew his measurements would continue shifting as his training progressed. Only a few days later, Adrian was already on his way to a grand banquet, where he would have to deal with the attention of special young ladies. His royal carriage rolled through the busy city streets, escorted by elite guards on every side, and at the front of the escort rode Sir Vale Balorhard, shining in his armor with a confident smile, looking as if he was ready to face anything that came their way. But inside the luxurious carriage, Adrian could not stop himself from grumbling under his breath. No matter how polished the seats were, or how grand the escort looked outside, all he could think was that being a prince was truly disgusting. His loyal attendant remained as diligent as ever, standing ready as he reported that every order Adrian had given had already been carried out exactly as instructed. Even so, Adrian's expression did not soften. A trace of irritation still lingered across his face, and his eyes looked distant, as though his mind had already moved on to whatever problem waited ahead. Then Adelia Byron's eyes suddenly widened and a small gasp caught in her throat. Her hand rested delicately against the bright fabric of her dress, frozen there as shock spread across her face. That gesture drew attention to the stark scar carved into the side of her neck, a harsh mark that could not be hidden. A voice soon pressed her for the story behind it. Adelia told Adrian that the scar was a brutal reminder from her past, a wound left behind by someone who had more than earned every ugly insult that could be thrown at them. The weight of yet another grim story struck Adrian harder than he expected. Inside, he almost screamed, wondering why this kept happening again and again. Dark purple energy crackled around him as frustration boiled over, and he silently raged at the fact that every time he dug into the past, another nightmare seemed to crawl out. Across from him, Adelia lowered her gaze, her expression growing quiet and inward. Even after months had passed since she had been separated from that past, the relief she expected still had not come. Adrian settled across from her and cut through the uneasy silence with a direct question, his eyes fixed on her without looking away. Meeting that intense stare, she finally gave him the name tied to her bloodline. "Byron, Your Highness," Adrian repeated the name softly, and recognition sparked in his eyes. It was not just any name. It belonged to a noble family he had heard of before. He could hardly believe that name had appeared in front of him here. Of all places, his thoughts drifted back to a far older age, long before cities took shape, when tribes still wandered the continent among countless different races. In that ancient era, humans were born with mana as naturally as breath, and among them were rare people strong enough to stand against the monsters that terrorized the land. Then, when the Great War finally reached its end, the people of the continent gave a legendary title to 5 extraordinary figures. They became known as the 5 heroes of the new era, and among those 5 heroes stood none other than Gruhorn. In the old memory, Gruhorn stood atop a jagged peak, looking down at a battlefield soaked in an ominous fiery glow. A deep question burned inside him as the chaos below stretched endlessly beneath his feet. He remembered the terrifying scale of the enemy. An enormous horde of tribal giants, their faces twisted with primal fury as they swung weapons powerful enough to crush the earth. Yet the red-cloaked warrior did not hesitate. He plunged from the heights with his sword flashing, crashing straight into the towering body of a giant. For a brief instant, an image of Adelia Byron flashed through his mind, her fiery hair and unwavering gaze tied to a promise about what they would do once the war was over. but the memory was violently torn apart by a blinding white slash of energy, followed by a devastating impact that thundered across the battlefield. And then Gruhorn stood victorious, lightning arcing around him as he rose above the collapsing body of a defeated giant beneath a burning sky. This was not the strength of an ordinary warrior, but the power of a legend who had carved his name into the age. A golden fist pulsed with raw, untamed force, radiating power that seemed impossible to measure. Before him stood the king of giants, the one said to have ended an era of conflict with his own hands, wrapped in a blinding golden aura. That overwhelming figure struck again, sending a colossal giant flying backward as if even its massive body could not withstand the blow. Then a fiery red-haired warrior burst into motion, her blade already singing as she launched herself into the battlefield. At the same time, the image of the ancient hero Gruhorn appeared, his tiger-skin cloak billowing as his gaze burned with fierce resolve. The warrior racing through the carnage was none other than the legendary iron-blooded sword angel. Her very presence carried the weight of a battlefield icon, and when she struck, her enemies were crushed beneath a devastating crash. Her eyes blazed with intense golden fire, shining with a will so fierce it seemed impossible to extinguish. Victorious, she stood tall above the fallen enemies around her, looking less like a person and more like a force of nature. That golden light in her eyes did not fade. Instead, it burned on like a warning that her next attack was already coming. With her blade still ready, she charged forward again and declared that she would grab something to eat only after she finished beating down everyone in her way. The iron-blooded sword angel stood like a whirlwind of crimson fury above a mountain of defeated foes. Her voice roared across the battlefield as she spat at them, saying they only ever thought about themselves, like pathetic worms. Her hand tightened around her sword as power surged through her grip, and she mocked the bodies they were so proud of as nothing more than tools fit for the lowest choices. Her face twisted into a furious snarl, the rage in her expression sharpening as if she wanted to crush their pride along with their skulls. A raw wave of crimson energy pulsed from her hand as she crushed the hilt in her grasp, making the metal groan under the sheer force of her strength. A memory snapped back to Adrian, his eyes glowing in the oppressive darkness. He scoffed and brushed the thought away, as if it disgusted him, muttering that even thinking about it dirtied his ears. A low, rough growl rumbled from his chest, and his face twisted with visible disgust as that unseen memory continued to cling to him. Adelia watched him closely, worry gathering in her eyes. She could not help but wonder what kind of memory had made him react with such open revulsion. Adrian's eyes snapped forward as his focus returned to the present. Just then, the carriage reached its destination, and the attendant announced that they had arrived. Adrian stepped toward the massive entrance with steady confidence, while Adelia walked beside him, her face still marked by concern. Beyond the grand golden archway, two familiar figures were already waiting. When Adrian spotted them, a faint smile tugged at his lips, and he remarked that their timing was perfect. He glanced briefly toward Adelia and lowered his voice. Whatever had just passed between them would have to wait. We'll talk later. Between Vale Balorhard and Arwen Kurgayan stood a striking young woman in a red gown, her eyes fixed directly on Adrian as he approached. Vale Balorhard immediately stepped forward with deep respect in his voice. "Your Highness? Have you arrived safely?" Before Prince Adrian Leonberg now stood a descendant of the Eli family, a bloodline many had believed was already lost to history. Her voice overflowed with relief as she looked at him. She said she could not even express how happy she was to see him safe and sound. Adrian's eyes narrowed as he took in her appearance, noticing how thin she had become. He remarked that she must have worked herself to the bone to end up looking like that. Then he let out a low, confident chuckle, as if the tense atmosphere had only made him more amused. Adelia, still worried, pressed him quietly and asked whether he was truly feeling all right. Adrian brushed off the concern with ease, coolly saying that his presence here alone was already a good thing. Then he made a suggestive little gesture and added that, thanks to her, today was going to be very entertaining. Adelia was left staring at him in complete confusion, unable to make sense of the cryptic remark. Adrian drew her a little closer, a smirk playing across his lips as he wondered aloud how she would react, almost as if he expected her to see something she had never witnessed before. His touch lingered just long enough for him to compliment her fine skin, and Adelia immediately flushed, flustered as she demanded that he stop teasing her. Setting shifted to a lavish chamber, where Adrian, Adelia, Vale Balorhard, Arwen Kurgayan, and the mysterious Eli descendant gathered around a low, ornate table. The Eli descendant closed her eyes, and a strange, almost unsettling expression crossed her face, as though she were sensing something deeply unusual. Her thoughts turned toward Adrian, because under normal circumstances, a man like the first prince would already be drunk, loud, and flirting with everyone in sight. But Adrian remained strangely calm, sitting there with a wine glass in hand while his golden hair caught the light. As he quietly looked over the room, someone nearby whispered that the feeling around him was completely different from the way he used to be. Adrian lowered his gaze for a moment, and even that small motion made the air around him feel slightly different, as if something behind his expression had shifted. Then a wide, almost mischievous grin spread across his face, His eyes narrowed with pure amusement, making it clear he was enjoying the situation far more than anyone expected. Adelia Byron, clearly irritated, snapped at him without holding back, accusing him of getting involved with the rich lion's daughter as if the rumor itself was already driving her mad. And of course, those rumors had already spread everywhere, all because of Adrian's outrageous past and the reputation he had left behind. With Adrian surrounded by Adelia Byron, Vale Ballarhard, Arwen Kurgayan, and the Eli descendant, Adelia kept pressing him. She said there was plenty more she could reveal, but her eyes had not been good enough to see it all. If she had known everything back then, she would have torn that woman's eyes out first. Adrian only grinned at her reaction, a strange thought passing through his mind. Even in armor, that woman had been stunning, but at the same time, she had been nothing short of a monster. He stared ahead as a darker, unsettling thought flickered through him. Something about flesh too tempting to ignore. Then, as if nothing strange had crossed his mind at all, he casually called out to Vale Ballarhard and asked a bizarre question. Did he have any siblings back home? For a moment, silence settled between them. Then Adrian tilted his head slightly, as if the answer should have been obvious, and reminded him that he had a younger brother. A cold smirk formed on Adrian's face as he lifted his drink and took a casual sip. Vale Ballarhard was left completely stunned, his eyes widening as he struggled to understand what Adrian was getting at. All he could manage was a broken, confused sound. Before Vale could finish that thought, a blinding crimson flash tore through the room. Adrian's blade moved with terrifying precision, cutting through the air faster than anyone could follow. The strike landed with brutal force, sending blood spraying across Vale Ballarhard's face. Pain twisted his expression as the shock of the blow crashed into him all at once. He hit the floor with a sickening sound, his body crumpling beneath the force of the attack. Adrian stood above the fallen man without the slightest hint of hesitation, as if victory had already been guaranteed. The room fell into a dead silence. Adelia Byron, Arwen Kurgayan, and the Eli descendant could only stare, their faces frozen in a mixture of horror, shock, and disbelief. For an instant, even Adrian's own face seemed to fracture with shock and anguish, his earlier composure breaking apart under the weight of what had just happened. Then a chilling voice cut through the silence. A new figure with red-burning eyes spoke coldly, saying it was a relief that the family line would not end there. A blinding burst of purple energy exploded the next second, crashing through the air with a deafening impact that made the whole space tremble. In the brutal aftermath, Adrian stood in dark, imposing robes over the fallen Vale Ballarhard, who lay utterly defeated on the luxurious floor beneath him. With red eyes blazing and a fierce, determined gaze fixed forward, the young man declared that a new era was beginning. Then Adrian struck again, unleashing a devastating blow with no hesitation at all. His fist slammed into the King of Leonberg with shocking force, snapping the king's head back in an act so brazen it felt like pure defiance against the throne itself. Adrian grabbed his father by the collar, fury burning in his eyes, while Taylor Talheim stood nearby, too stunned to immediately move. Taylor finally shouted in disbelief, demanding to know what madness had taken hold of the prince and why he would commit such an outrageous act. But before Taylor could even begin to process the answer, Adrian moved again and drove a lightning-fast kick straight into his stomach. Taylor doubled over, gasping for air as he collapsed, his voice trembling with disbelief, while he tried to question Adrian's motives. Adrian ignored him and drove another brutal punch into the king's already battered face. The King of Leonberg staggered under the punishment, his face smeared with blood and bruises as Adrian loomed over him like a storm that refused to stop. Then Adrian looked down at Taylor, who was still writhing on the floor. Even through the pain, Taylor insisted that this treatment was unacceptable. Adrian Leonberg showed no sign of holding back, his fist blurred with glowing energy as it slammed into the king again, and he coldly declared that his father needed to suffer even more. The impact sent the king flying, a strangled cry escaping him as blood burst from his face. Adrian barely spared Taylor Talheim another glance. His focus stayed locked on the king, now collapsed in a broken heap on the ground. Then another merciless blow landed, the impact tearing through the air with frightening violence. Adrian stared down at his father's ruined body, while Taylor could only watch in horror, helpless to stop the nightmare unfolding before him. The king's face had become a battered mess of blood and bruises, his eyes shut tight as he lay completely unconscious. After the carnage finally paused, Adrian dropped to his knees and lowered his head. Into the heavy silence, he whispered a single haunting name. Eli? He stood over the fallen knight with chilling authority in his voice, making it clear that he was the one giving orders now. A sinister smile curled across his face, his eyes glowing an unsettling red, as he declared that this day was about to become very interesting. The knight, still shaken by everything that had just happened, could only stare up at Adrian in terror, unable to understand what had become of the prince. Then Adrian gave him a shocking command, ordering him to bring the royal knights immediately. Once the order was spoken, he simply turned away and walked off. Even though Taylor Talheim was still shaken to his core, his loyalty forced his body to move. He pushed himself up and set out to obey the prince's terrifying order. The grand royal palace loomed in silence, its massive walls standing over the chaos as if watching everything unfold. Adrian then stormed into another chamber, where several women and others sat gathered around a huge circular table. He did not waste a single breath on greetings. The moment he entered, he cut straight to the point and ordered every woman in the room to leave at once. Meanwhile, the double-chain knight Vale Balarhard moved through the palace halls with serious purpose, his expression set and unreadable. Each step rang sharply against the polished floor, creating a steady rhythm that carried his determination through the corridor. Back in the chamber, Adrian Leonberg turned sharply, his eyes locking onto a man who had dared to remain seated. In a cold voice he reminded him, "I believe I said women." His face hardened with icy fury as he continued. If the man wanted to leave, he could leave. But before the man could react, Adrian's hand shot out and clamped down on his shoulder with crushing force. His voice dropped into a dangerous growl as he warned that if the man did leave, he would be leaving as a woman. A guttural scream of agony ripped through the chamber as Adrian slammed the man to the floor, leaving him shaking, terrified and broken beneath the weight of the prince's brutality. The women in the room froze in horror, while the remaining men sat in stunned silence, too afraid to speak or even move. Then, one after another, the women hurried out of the chamber, their footsteps quick and hushed as they fled the terrifying scene. Once the women were gone, Adrian's piercing gaze swept over the men left behind, now kneeling before him. His voice dripped with contempt, as he snarled that not a single one of them had properly knelt before a prince. Then he pressed harder, accusing them with cold authority of showing him absolutely no respect. A dark-mustached man grimaced in fear as Adrian's accusation landed on him, the prince making it clear that they had dared to mock him directly to his face. Adrian's eyes blazed with an electric blue light that felt almost inhuman. His voice dropped low and dangerous as he added the true insult he would not forgive. They had insulted his knight. He loomed over the trembling man, his presence filling the chamber so completely that no one dared to breathe too loudly. The man's hand clenched tightly, as if that alone could keep him from falling apart. With fear cracking through his voice, he barely managed to stammer out a question, asking what charges could possibly apply in a situation like this. Adrian's hand cut sharply through the air, the motion cold and final, as if he were slicing away every excuse they might have tried to hide behind. Since they had dared to look down on royalty itself, their insult was no longer a petty slight against one prince. It had become a direct challenge to the authority of the entire royal family. A second man stood frozen nearby, his purple hair making his bloodless, terrified face look even paler as Adrian's words sank in. Adrian made the charge painfully clear. The moment they challenged the dignity of the royal family, their offense became something far heavier. His armored hand rested against his hip, and his voice dropped like a death sentence as he declared that such an act was no different from treason. With that horrifying judgment hanging over the hall, Adrian slowly looked across the figures now forced to their knees. His gaze moved from one trembling noble to the next, cold and deliberate, before he asked with chilling calm, which of them should be accused of high treason first? Adrian Leonberg's eyes narrowed, and the weight of what he had set in motion became impossible to ignore. 14 nobles, along with the retainers who followed them, had already been seized, dragged into the consequences of the very arrogance they had displayed. He stood above them like a judgment carved in armor, looking out over the enormous hall where countless figures had been pressed down to their knees. The grand space that once belonged to noble pride now felt more like a courtroom awaiting punishment. After turning a simple confrontation into a storm that shook the entire palace, Adrian understood that the decisive moment had finally arrived. Before him, the kneeling crowd waited in dread, and behind him, the massive window and towering architecture only made his lone figure seem even more imposing, as though the whole hall had fallen under his command. Somewhere else inside the palace, the King of Leonberg received the shocking report. His expression darkened as he listened, the words loyalty and treason weighing heavily on his face while the scale of Adrian's accusations began to settle in. Adrian, however, remained completely unmoved. His eyes stayed steady and sharp, showing no trace of panic, as though he had already accepted every consequence that might come from the dangerous move he had just made. The King of Leonberg was far from calm. His brow tightened as he muttered that because Adrian had invoked the royal family's name, those men had been trapped in a situation they could no longer escape. And with 14 noble families now involved, he knew this was no minor disturbance that could be quietly buried or brushed aside. Adrian leaned forward slightly, the corner of his mouth lifting into a faint provocative smirk. He looked straight at the crowned ruler before him and asked whether His Majesty was truly afraid of the backlash this scandal would bring. Seated on his throne, the King of Leonberg tried to wave the matter away, saying those families were insignificant even among the nobility, but Adrian did not let that excuse stand. He immediately pushed back, pointing out that these so-called nobodies were exactly the schemers who had dared to use the king's own name to advance their plans. Adrian gave only a cold scoff in response, his face hard and unreadable, as though the king's attempt to downplay the matter had not impressed him in the slightest. When the King of Leonberg tried to shift the subject and asked about the letter, Adrian shut the question down almost at once. He told him there was no need to pretend ignorance, since the king's own people handled matters like that, and surely knew exactly what it contained. Adrian then laid it out plainly. The letter concerned the brothers and sisters of those treacherous scoundrels, the remaining ties and branches of the families now caught in the shadow of treason. The king of Leonberg remained seated, but worry slowly crept across his face. Adrian's blunt honesty had landed heavily, leaving the ruler to sit with the ugly reality of what had just been dragged into the open. Adrian had already begun thinking of his next move, deciding it was time to leave before the conversation dragged on any longer. He gave a short, obedient "yes, sir," and turned as if to step away from the ornate hall, only for the king's voice to cut after him, sharp and needling, asking if he truly had nothing else to say. Then, almost as if mocking him, the king tried to tell Adrian that he did not need to be so tense, but Adrian did not soften. He held his ground, met that gaze without flinching, and made it clear that he had no intention of backing down. A young woman stood before him with her hands clasped tightly, distress written across every line of her face. Her voice trembled as she pleaded with him, desperate to understand what her family could have possibly done to deserve such a cruel fate. Adrian looked down at her without a trace of pity, only a faint and chilling smile touching his lips. In a calm voice that made the words even colder, he told her that the scoundrel she defended had already chosen and sealed her own fate. Adelia Byrne turned her face away, sorrow tightening her expression as memories of her family's long devotion to the crown weighed on her heart. For generations, the Byrne family had offered loyalty so deep and quiet that even the royal family itself had never truly understood the extent of it. His words seemed to turn that proud history into a bleak vision, as if a once powerful noble house had been reduced to nothing more than broken stones, empty halls, and ruins swallowed by silence. In that grim image, a fallen knight lay among the wreckage, cast down in the shadows. The legendary arms that had once carried honor and strength were severed, leaving behind only the hollow remains of a power that had completely vanished. Adrian's smile grew wider, almost dangerous, as if he were savoring the bitter irony of it all. Their grand reputation, their towering pride, and the prestige they had clung to for so long now only made their fall seem that much more satisfying. Adelia's hands curled into tight fists at her sides, her grief hardening into a fierce resolve. Deep inside, she swore that she would not simply let Adrian walk away after trampling over everything her family had carried. A quiet sound escaped Adrian as his eyes settled on the glowing display before him. The information hovering there did not line up neatly at all, and the contradictions were so sharp that even he had to pause and take them in. What appeared before him was the image of a warrior soaked in blood and sharpened by battle. Someone who carried the traits of a butcher and a war maniac. She seemed like the kind of person who could be driven mad by the sight of blood, drawn toward conflict with terrifying obsession, and yet somehow, beneath all that violence, she also possessed a fragile and tender heart. The display revealed even more contradictions. She had the qualities of a caregiver, someone naturally suited to tending to and looking after others, but she also carried a deeply rooted slave mentality. She had spent her life struggling to restrain the enormous power inside her, and now, as if fate were mocking her, she could not even properly control her own body. Later, inside a lavish chamber filled with the quiet weight of palace luxury, the young prince scratched his head with a troubled look on his face. Nearby, Adelia watched him closely, her expression full of concern as she waited for what he would decide. Adrian turned his back to the room and looked out through the grand window, his figure outlined against the light beyond the glass. After a long moment, he questioned aloud whether it was truly all right for him to release someone like her into the world. Then his eyes sharpened, doubt giving way to resolve as he turned back from the window. Whatever risk waited ahead, he silently reached the same answer. He had no choice but to try. This S-rank talent was not simply powerful in the usual sense. It was a strange and dangerous combination, with exceptional mana sensitivity at the very top, while unstable traits like butcher, war maniac, fragile heart, and caregiver all existed inside the same person. And among those traits was something even more unsettling: slave mentality, a nature built around absolute devotion to serving another. It meant she could find complete joy in offering herself wholly to a master, and that single detail changed the meaning of everything Adrian was looking at. As all of that information settled in Adrian's mind, he was already standing before Adelia, his gaze fixed firmly on her. Adelia looked up at him, then reached out her hand and told him to swear loyalty to her. But the instant the words and the situation truly registered, shock rushed across her face. She faltered, staring at him in disbelief as she stammered, unable to understand what he was even talking about. Adrian did not soften or laugh it off. With a completely serious expression, he told her exactly what he meant. He wanted her to become his knight. His gaze pressed down on her with unshakable intensity as he demanded that she swear the oath right there and then. Adelia, now on her knees before him, could only let out a stunned gasp. The demand had struck her so suddenly that for a moment she looked utterly blindsided, as if the world had tilted beneath her, her face filled with a mixture of fear and disbelief. her eyes wide as she struggled to process the unbelievable turn the conversation had taken. Then, still shaken, she threw Adrian's own words back at him, unable to keep the accusation from rising in her voice. Only moments earlier he had called her family insignificant, and now he was demanding an oath from her as if that insult had never happened. Even so, Adelia lowered herself before Adrian and made the ultimate vow. With her head bowed and her resolve forced into place, she declared that she would serve His Highness, Prince Adrian Leonberg, with unwavering loyalty. Adrian answered with a single heavy word, and that was all it took for the oath to deepen. Adelia continued, pledging not just her sword or her obedience, but her entire life to his service. Another sharp good left Adrian's mouth, simple and commanding, as he extended his hand toward her like he was accepting not just her vow, but her future as well. A faint blue glow gathered around Adrian as he set the terms with absolute clarity. From that day forward, he commanded her unconditional obedience, and Adelia answered without hesitation or doubt, accepting his will as her command. Her eyes slowly fluttered shut, and a faint blush rose across her face as the full weight of the pledge settled over her. The oath was no longer just words, it had taken hold of her completely. Adrian watched her in silence, a subtle smirk still resting on his lips, yet even as he looked down at the knight who had just sworn herself to him. One question lingered in his mind. Had he truly made the right choice? Before long, rumors began spreading through the palace and beyond. People whispered that the first prince had been strangely quiet for a while, and some even wondered whether Adrian had finally given up on the struggle surrounding the crown. But the truth was far more outrageous. He had not only pressured a royal-connected young woman into a knight's oath, he had also imprisoned noble children who refused him. Those who resisted were not given gentle treatment or quiet warnings. They were thrown straight into the dungeon, as if Adrian had no intention of letting noble blood protect anyone from the consequences. From there, the rumors only grew wilder. People began saying Adrian was obsessively searching for a personal knight, and many claimed that this so-called search was nothing more than a clever excuse to gather warriors and build a private army of his own. Adrian himself could not help wondering why everyone had suddenly become so fascinated with him and his supposed quest for personal knights. From his point of view, the whole thing had been blown completely out of proportion. He grumbled inwardly that he had only taken in one personal knight, nothing more, while Vale Balarhard stood nearby with his usual steady loyalty. But before Adrian could settle the matter in his own mind, an older and unmistakably regal voice cut in, telling him that he had been a source of trouble since birth, and that cleaning up the mess he had just created was giving the speaker a truly massive headache. The crowned ruler's patience had clearly reached its limit, his eyes sharpened into a withering glare, the kind that could make an entire room fall silent without him needing to raise his voice. He continued pressing Adrian without mercy, openly accusing him of running around after women instead of focusing on what truly mattered. Then, with brutal contempt, he summed it all up in one cutting word: pathetic. The air between them tightened as the older royal figure stood with his back turned, demanding to know whether Adrian had completely given up on their wager. Adrian only answered with a sly smile tugging at his lips. Rather than looking ashamed, he shot back with the same sharp tongue, mocking the old man for acting surprised that he would appoint a maid as a knight, as though that kind of stubborn move suited him perfectly. Still wearing that faintly amused look, Adrian wondered how rumors could possibly spread through the palace so quickly. But before he could even settle on an answer, a loud voice rang out from beyond the room, announcing that the queen had arrived. Adrian, seated on the throne, visibly stiffened at the sudden announcement. A moment later, Queen Margarita appeared before him with an overwhelming presence, majestic and composed, while her maid followed closely behind her. Queen Margarita fixed him with an irritated stare, clearly disappointed by what she had heard. She told him she had believed he had finally changed, but now it seemed he was simply falling back into the same old habits all over again. Then her expression shifted, her eyes filling with firm determination. As if she had reached a decision on the spot, she declared that perhaps this situation had actually turned out perfectly. Adrian froze in utter disbelief, his composure cracking under the pressure of her words. Frustration flared through him so sharply that he cursed under his breath, unable to hide how badly the turn of events had rattled him. Queen Margarita did not back down for even a second. With a fierce glare that left no room for argument, she delivered her ultimatum. This time, she would be the one to find him a proper spouse. Adrian sank back into the throne, his posture loose and defeated as a long, exhausted sigh escaped him. With everything piling up at once, his eyes lost focus, and he muttered that he honestly did not even know what was happening anymore. Somewhere else, Adelia Byrne sat quietly by herself, her expression thoughtful and distant, as if she were still trying to understand the strange path her life had suddenly taken. At last, Adelia turned toward Adrian and asked whether she would be able to receive mana as well. Adrian answered firmly that she would, then looked at her with a knowing expression and added that it would not be ordinary mana, but a very special kind. Blue energy suddenly burst from Adrian's hand, flickering like living flame around his fingers. As the power gathered, his thoughts raced toward one bitter truth. The world had completely forgotten the sword marquee and everything that name had once meant. Adelia's eyes lit up with a brilliant golden glow, the light burning fiercely within them. Her face, once uncertain, now reflected a determination that seemed to rise in answer to the power awakening before her. A fierce red aura flared around Adrian's body, wrapping him in a heat-like radiance as his voice rang out with absolute conviction. He had not forgotten a single thing. Then a blinding golden light erupted, drawing out the very essence of Adelia's past and the footsteps she had left behind. Along with that light came the image of a phantom sword, the weapon that had once danced at her fingertips, as if it were part of her own soul. Every fragment of that forgotten path gathered together, swelling into a vivid, living aura that felt almost impossible to believe. That radiant energy shimmered with a power too vast to put into simple words. It moved wildly at first, surging and pulsing through the air, before gradually beginning to fall into rhythm with a magnificent beating sound. And that rhythm came from Adelia's own heart, beating steadily beneath the rising storm of golden light. Golden brilliance surged even higher, wild and overwhelming, as Adelia Byron felt mana rush through her entire body. Her eyes burned as though power itself had taken root inside her. Adrian watched in stunned silence as the mana successfully carved its mark into Adelia's very being. The process had worked, and the change happening before his eyes was impossible to deny. Adelia's gaze had changed completely. A deeper light now rested within her eyes, carrying the unmistakable weight of mana that had finally settled inside her body. A golden glow burst from her hand, bright and undeniable, as raw power surged outward from her. Adelia could only gasp in astonishment, staring at the force that had answered her as if it truly belonged to her. As the full scale of the transformation struck her, Adrian stood over her with a firm and commanding presence. He declared that the ritual was complete, and from that moment onward, she was his warrior, which meant he would be the one guiding and taking responsibility for her. Adelia was so overwhelmed by the sudden weight of his declaration that she could barely speak. All she managed to force out was his title, her voice trembling with disbelief. When she noticed Adrian's exhausted eyes as he turned slightly away, concern immediately crossed her face. Adrian released a heavy sigh, clearly drained by the entire ordeal, grumbling that going through all of that for one person's mana heart had taken far more effort than anyone would expect. Still shaken by everything that had happened, Adelia looked at him and challenged him directly. She demanded to know why he would go so far for someone as lowly as her. For a moment, silence settled heavily between them, thick enough that even the smallest movement seemed to stand out. But Adelia could not let the question go. She pressed him again, her voice filled with confusion and emotion, asking why he was being so kind to her in the first place. Then, overcome by fierce resolve and deep gratitude, Adelia Byron lowered herself into a profound bow before him. She vowed to serve Adrian with every part of herself for the rest of her life. A nervous sweat drop seemed to break the seriousness of the moment as Adrian quickly set the boundary in his own blunt way. He told her not to forget who he was, her master. Adelia's eyes snapped wide open at once, and her response came bursting out with almost startling eagerness. She answered again and again, making it clear that she understood. Adrian turned away from her, his figure quiet but commanding, carrying the kind of presence that did not need many words. Then he glanced back with a piercing look and warned that he was afraid she might forget. Adelia's expression fell slightly, and with a soft, resigned answer, she accepted his concern as if she knew he was right to say it. A few days passed. Sir Vale Balerhard stood before Adrian with the steady discipline of a loyal knight, addressing him formally as he brought up the matter concerning Bernardo Eli. Adrian listened as Vale continued the report. According to what he had been told, Bernardo Eli had been granted permission to see her up until a certain point. Adrian's eyes flashed with disbelief the moment he heard it. He demanded to know whether that was truly the case, and annoyance quickly rose in his voice as he asked if he was really expected to repeat the entire trial again. In his mind, the thought was absurd. Royalty did not stand before trials like common offenders, and yet this latest piece of news had somehow managed to make the situation even more troublesome. Still caught in thought, Adrian sat with a cup in hand, outwardly relaxed, despite the irritation simmering beneath the surface. As another man listened nearby, he spoke in a measured tone about what it meant to be a man of proportion. Then his attention shifted toward Adelia. He asked her directly how she was doing, and she flinched slightly at the sudden question. When she asked what he meant, Adrian went straight to the point and asked whether her mana heart had stabilized yet. Adelia answered with proper respect, confirming that everything was fine. Her posture remained composed as she addressed him formally as, "Your Highness." Adrian did not waste another second. Without hesitation, he told her that starting that very day, she would be joining his training. He gave her a confident thumbs up, as if the decision had already been settled beyond discussion. Then he ordered her to change clothes and meet him at the training grounds, making it clear there would be no excuses. And just as she was absorbing that command, Adrian added one more thing. He told her to leave the bag behind, because that was a knight's bag, not something meant for her to keep carrying around like a servant. Soon after, the scene shifted to the training grounds, where Adrian was already waiting. He stretched his body with practiced ease, loosening himself up as if preparing to push the coming session as hard as possible. Adrian Leon Burke, looking sharp even in a simple casual shirt, snapped at his attendant with irritation. His eyes narrowed as he demanded to know what the man thought he was doing. Then Adrian gave a confident smirk and clarified the situation himself. He was only warming up, nothing more, and his relaxed confidence made it clear he was ready for what came next. But his attention quickly moved to Adelia Byrne, who had arrived fully armored and looking far more serious than before. Adrian pointed out that he had been talking about her, just as her armored boot struck the ground with a solid heavy thud. Then Adrian dropped the shocking announcement in front of Vale Ballarhard. He intended to make Adelia a knight. Vale's face tightened with disbelief and concern, his composure almost cracking at the words. To him, the idea sounded reckless, and he could not understand how Adrian could treat the title of knight so casually. Adrian brushed off the objection without hesitation, telling Vale to back off and asking when he had become so nosy. Then, as if throwing the challenge right back in his face, Adrian told him that if he was so bothered by it, he could try handling the matter himself. Adelia Byrne marched past them without slowing, her armor clanking with each firm step as she headed toward the training grounds. Behind her, Vale Ballarhard called out anxiously to His Highness, his voice carrying clear worry over what Adrian had just decided. By the time Adelia finally stopped, her strength had nearly drained away. She dropped heavily to her knees, breathing hard, and forced out the words that she had completed all 10 laps. But Adrian Leon Burke had no intention of letting her rest for long. To him, that brutal physical training was only the beginning, just enough to wake up her body. Now came the part that truly mattered, putting a sword in her hands and teaching her how to wield it properly. Adelia lowered her head, her voice quiet as she apologized for the weakness of her past self. Yet despite the humility in her words, her eyes had changed completely, burning with a new determination that said she was ready to give everything. Adrian noticed that fire in her gaze and answered it with a knowing smirk. He started from the very beginning, breaking down the most basic stance first, where to place her feet, how to hold her body, and how to build a foundation solid enough for real swordsmanship. Then his blade flashed. Adrian moved with deadly elegance, the sword cutting through the air in a smooth, powerful blur before completing a flawless arc that made the entire motion look effortless. After showing her the movement, Adrian handed the sword over without any extra explanation. His meaning was simple and direct. It was Adelia's turn now. Adelia tried to copy what he had done, but her body could not match him so easily. Her posture came out stiff and uneven, with awkward angles that looked nothing like Adrian's natural grace. Then, as she focused harder, something strange sparked within her. A faint, otherworldly green light flickered in her eye, like a new power suddenly stirring awake beneath the surface. Adelia's training quickly grew sharper and more intense. Her sword sliced through the air and landed with a ringing impact. And when she stepped back, her armored foot struck the ground with a heavy thud, already preparing for the next motion. Adrian watched her closely. His gaze narrowed with the focus of a mentor who refused to miss even the smallest detail. The sight left him stunned. In his mind, one thought rose above everything else. She had copied the move almost perfectly after seeing it only once. Adelia looked up at him with eager, searching eyes, still holding the sword as she asked whether her stance had been correct. Adrian's eyes flashed with surprise for a brief moment before narrowing again. Not even a minute had passed, and she had already reached that level of imitation. He realized he could not afford to relax around her, not even for a second. After all, this was supposed to be the weakest training partner of the eldest royal, and yet she was already showing signs that could overturn that assumption. Then Adelia's eyes lit up again with that eerie green glow, and a dangerous thought shot through Adrian's mind. What if at this rate, she surpassed him right here and now? The thought struck him like a sudden shock, sharp enough to leave him momentarily frozen in place. Adrian could only let out a low sound as his thoughts raced, completely shaken by the raw talent unfolding in front of him. But before he could fully process what he had seen, Vale Ballarhard was already beside him, gripping his arm. Vale's voice came out harsh and urgent as he demanded to know what Adrian thought he was doing. Adrian's expression twisted into a silent challenge, his eyes making it clear he had no intention of lowering his head. Vale's warning crackled through the air as he told Adrian not to even think about coveting Adelia. But Adrian did not step back. Instead, he fired a cutting question right back at him, asking what Vale could possibly offer that child. Vale scoffed as if the answer was obvious. To him, Adrian was still a novice, someone who had only held a sword for a few months and had no right to speak so boldly. But as Vale's dismissal hung in the air, raw blue energy erupted around Adrian, crackling wildly as his eyes blazed with an unnatural light. Wrapped in that surging power, Adrian's voice turned cold as he declared that Vale Ballarhard could not handle her. Adrian's eyes narrowed, and a fierce resolve hardened inside him. The weakness of his former self was no longer something he would accept or allow anyone to use against him. That old version of him was already gone. Adrian made it clear that he had moved beyond it. and the power he carried now belonged to a completely different level. His eyes burned brighter with blue light as he steeled himself for the true burden ahead. If protecting Adelia meant facing a trial that others could not endure, then he would take that challenge himself. A massive blue aura exploded around him, swirling like a storm and pouring out with enough force to make the space around him feel almost unbearable. With his eyes blazing, Adrian made his answer absolute. If Vale could not handle it, then no. Adrian himself could. Because Adrian was not speaking from empty pride. His mind flashed back through nightmare after nightmare, through battles so monstrous that ordinary warriors would have broken just remembering them. He had faced the Giant King, the Mad Dragon, and countless other terrifying creatures that should never have been challenged by a single blade. In those memories, a legendary weapon gleamed through blood and chaos, proof of the savage history he had survived. That blade seemed to carry the echoes of endless battle within it. Every strike and every slaughter folded into its power, until that legacy had become inseparable from him. The legendary sword known as Gruhorn pulsed with ominous red energy, as though the weapon itself still remembered the blood-soaked path it had once carved. It was no ordinary weapon. A portion of its user's soul and mana was transferred directly into the blade, and now that power was surfacing again, burning fiercely through Adrian's crimson-tinged eyes. His gaze deepened into an infernal red, fierce and unwavering, carrying a terrifying resolve that would not bend before anyone. Vale Balarhard could only stare, stunned by what he was seeing. For the first time, genuine concern flickered across his face as he took in the sheer scale of the transformation before him. Adrian stood firm against the darkness of the night behind him, his voice low and absolute as he began to speak. Red light around him flared even stronger, almost bursting outward with the force of his conviction. Then he finished with one word, heavy and undeniable. Mine. Adrian Leonberg, carrying the ancient presence of Gruhorn within him, laid claim to Adelia with a possessiveness that felt almost like a warning. His body erupted in crimson aura, silently daring anyone to even look at what he had chosen as his own. His eyes burned with a razor-sharp intensity that did not waver. From him came a chilling hatred toward anyone foolish enough to challenge his will or reach for what he had already claimed. Then the prince turned, his armored figure moving with quiet force, the raw power around him making even that simple motion feel overwhelming. One of his eyes flared with a dark, blood-red glow, ominous enough to make the air around him seem heavier. A soft, unsettling gurgle slipped from him as his face twisted in sudden distress. It was as if some invisible force had wrapped around him, dragging his awareness away and blurring the world into a place he could no longer fully grasp. Adrian began to lose himself, unable to even hold on to the feeling of life and vitality. He sank into a dark, watery abyss where cold pressed against him from every side. And the deeper he fell, the more his senses slipped into absolute darkness. In that blackness, his eyes ignited, and a single question rose from him in dread. Was this the dark prophecy beginning to unfold? His body drifted helplessly through the void, and a chilling realization pierced through him. At this rate he would be finished. But then from the depths of that abyss, thorn-like energy erupted around a spectral blade as the true power of Gruhorn began to awaken. The monstrous presence roared through the darkness, declaring that this pathetic body would be devoured by the soul of Gruhorn. Shadowy hands with clawed fingers lunged out from the void, reaching for him from every direction. Horror spread across Adrian's face as they tried to drag him deeper into the abyss. Then his eyes snapped open, one of them blazing crimson, as the terrifying truth finally became clear to him. This was the real danger he had failed to see. Instead of surrendering, Adrian surged back with fierce defiance. He planted his feet on a glowing blue platform beneath him and roared for it to stop. That defiance exploded into furious blue energy around him. Spectral forms burst into existence at his side, crackling with wild, untamed power as Adrian pushed back against the darkness trying to swallow him. Adrian's gaze sharpened in the darkness, his eyes blazing with an unnatural blue light that made him look less like a prince and more like something ancient forcing its way back into the world. His hand shot forward, cutting through the chaos as if giving the wild surge a command. The blue power roared in response, swelling with a deep, deafening hum before hardening into a force that finally bent itself to his will. Adrian stood there like a pillar of power, his aura pouring out in waves so intense it felt capable of changing the course of everything around him. After all, there was an old saying that one ordinary knight could save 10 soldiers. Vale Balarhard silently turned that saying over in his mind, his face grim and thoughtful. The words echoed heavily inside him, carrying the weight of countless battlefields and the lives a single knight might protect. But Adelia Bayern pushed that idea even further. To her, a knight of true worth was not someone who saved 10 lives. Such a person could save 100. Before the towering castle, Adelia's conviction rang out clearly. She declared that a child with that kind of potential could lead a revolution right now, even before the eyes of royalty itself. Looking out over the frozen northern lands, Adelia stood firm in that belief. For the commander of the northern frontier, Her conclusion was already settled. She was convinced. Vale Balarhard's gaze grew sharper as he questioned what truly made a great cause worth pursuing. Yet just as the weight of that question settled between them, the conversation shifted in an entirely different direction. Adrian cut through the moment with blunt defiance. He did not hesitate, did not soften his voice, and simply declared that he did not care. Count Balarhard pressed him anyway, refusing to let the matter end there. His words suggested that even the chance to save countless lives might not be enough to move Adrian from his decision. And Adelia's loyalty answered louder than any argument. Her body and heart had already been pledged to His Highness, and she stood firm, refusing to be swayed by the Count's reasoning. Vale Balarhard still did not give up. With the force of a man chasing a larger ambition, he demanded an effort worthy of the grand future he believed they could reach. Adrian's answer came sharp and immediate. That single no struck through the air, rejecting even the words Adelia had once recalled with such conviction. Then Adrian turned the pressure back on his uncle, challenging whether Vale truly had nothing more to teach him. And beneath all the stern speeches, the Count's surprisingly simple motive finally came through. He had really wanted to help Adrian shed some weight. Adrian set the boundary with Vale Balarhard in no uncertain terms. If Vale wanted to remain in his palace, then he needed to stop interfering in Adrian's affairs. Beside him, Adelia's loyalty did not waver for even a breath, her heart crying that she would never go against His Highness's will. Vale Balarhard absorbed it all without letting much show on his face. His expression stayed unreadable, almost perfectly blank before he finally gave a short answer and accepted it. No matter what happened after that, Adelia never drifted far from Adrian's side. Her hand stayed close around her sword, and her watchful presence became a silent promise that she would defend him the moment danger appeared. Later, as Adrian walked with Adelia beside him, her devotion remained as intense as ever. She even admitted honestly that doing nothing but serving him felt strangely enjoyable to her. Adrian's attention shifted to a sword that seemed to hum with quiet power. He stared at it, curiosity tugging at his expression, and a small sound of interest slipped from him. Golden energy pulsed around the blade, washing the nearby armor in its glow and lighting the ground around their feet with a warm, flickering radiance. A scarred, dark-haired man stood nearby, his gaze sharp enough to silence a room. Everything about him radiated authority, from the set of his shoulders to the intensity in his eyes. That piercing stare was enough to make Adrian recoil slightly, caught off guard by the sudden pressure. The man demanded to know why Adelia, the one assisting him with the sword, was still there at all. Then, with an abrupt clap that felt almost mocking, the man turned his attention toward Adelia and praised her work, as if her success only made Adrian look even more troublesome. Adrian looked uncharacteristically sheepish, as he admitted that he might have pushed things a little too far, especially considering how quickly Adelia was improving. But the older man's mood shifted in an instant. His face hardened into something cold and dangerous as he asked Adrian whether he had also taught Adelia that technique. Adrian blinked in confusion, worry flickering across his face as he confirmed that he had. Then he asked plainly whether there was a problem with it. The man's anger erupted at once. He shouted that it was bad enough for Adrian alone to master such a cheap trick, and now he had gone and taught it to someone else as well. Adrian closed his eyes for a moment, visibly weighed down by the sudden storm of pressure crashing down on him. Then the older man, his expression dark as thunder, delivered the verdict without mercy. He ordered Adrian to get out. Adrian stood his ground while the furious Count tore into him, insisting that there had been a better path and a greater potential. Adrian could not even begin to understand. With his eyes burning red, the Count's rage finally exploded as he accused Adrian of ruining everything. Vale Balarhard, Adrian's loyal knight, moved as if to step in, addressing his prince with careful respect. But the Count immediately cut across him, demanding that Adrian leave at once. Adrian refused to be chased out like a scolded child. He turned his back with his pride still intact and made it clear that if he was leaving, he would walk out on his own 2 feet. A quiet, almost contemptuous sound seemed to linger in the air as Adrian strode away. Behind him, the Count remained fuming, left to glare at the prince's back. Vale Balarhard followed after his prince, still visibly worried. Meanwhile, Adrian's thoughts churned, and for a moment he wondered whether his teaching really had been nothing more than a cheap trick after all. But that doubt did not last. Adrian immediately shook it off, knowing deep down that the accusation was wrong. His loyal knight finally cut straight to the point, unable to hide his concern as he asked why the Count would say something like that in the first place. Adrian answered with a knowing look, saying that the Count and everyone else living in this age simply did not understand. Even so, the Count's furious words still rang behind them, claiming that Adrian's teachings had completely lost sight of what mana truly was. Adrian clicked his tongue at that idea, clearly unimpressed. If they had truly understood what they were dealing with, they would never have thrown it aside like garbage. Then, with a faint smirk, he promised that they would understand soon enough. With that, Adrian turned and continued away from the city, his loyal knight following close behind. As he walked, a powerful realization settled deeper inside him. The mana heart held a power far greater than anyone around him seemed to comprehend. As if proving that very thought, faint blue sparks began to crackle around Adrian's body. A moment later, the energy surged outward in a silent but overwhelming burst of raw power. Adrian stood with his arms crossed, his face carved with absolute resolve, looking like someone who had already chosen his path and would not be dragged away from it. Then he glanced upward and remarked almost casually that the other person had acted as if he would never return. His knight, walking behind him, quickly answered that he had only been following his highness's orders. The Count met Adrian with a steely gaze and threw down the challenge. He was prepared to shape Adrian into a true king, but only if the prince could break through his defenses and prove he was worthy. Adrian already had his hand near the hilt, his focus sharpening as he cut straight past the theatrics. He demanded to know what the actual wager was. He moved into position as if ready to strike at any moment. The Count's voice boomed out across the space, announcing the stake with absolute confidence. A wish. The Count made the terms clear. If Adrian could break through, he would earn any wish he wanted. But if he failed, then he would have to hand over his mana heart. Adrian remained calm, a smirk tugging at his lips as though the danger only made the wager more interesting. For now, he agreed to stake one wish. Their reflections shimmered as the tension thickened between them, and Adrian quickly clarified that this was not exactly what he had meant. But the Count's helmet gleamed under the light as his voice thundered out, ending the discussion with one command: fight. A sly grin spread across the Count's face, revealing that this confrontation had not been sudden at all. He had been preparing the next battle from the very beginning. Adrian was still absorbing the sheer audacity of the Count's challenge, but the venom in those words had already struck deep. The fight was no longer just a test. It had become a provocation he could not simply ignore. But Count Balarhard gave Adrian no time to settle his thoughts. Wrapped in a whirlwind of dark intent, he launched forward in a blinding rush, his spear already thrust out like an extension of his iron will. Adrian's blade flared to life in response, catching the incoming strike head-on. The two weapons collided with a deafening clang that rang through the air like a bell of war. Count Balarhard did not stop with a single blow. He drove forward with a relentless storm of attacks, each strike heavier and sharper than the last, forcing the young prince to defend with every ounce of focus he had. The spear became nothing more than a deadly blur in front of him, a shining streak of killing intent that cut through the space between them again and again. But Adrian refused to keep retreating. With a burst of strength, he pushed back, and his counterattack tore through the air with enough force to send a shockwave rippling outward. Count Balarhard only grinned at the attempt. His eyes blazed with dark power, and his voice dripped with contempt as he mocked Adrian, asking if that was truly all he had. The young prince's expression hardened at once. Frustration flashed across his face, but beneath it burned a fierce resolve that refused to break under the Count's pressure. Adrian kicked off the ground with explosive force, white energy bursting around him as he shook off the force of the Count's brutal assault and threw himself back into motion. Count Balarhard watched him without the slightest change in expression, his face as hard as stone. Then his cold voice cut through the tension, asking whether Adrian had already given up. Adrian held his stance, fully aware that the opponent before him was almost impossibly strong. Even so, the idea of losing was something he simply could not allow. Then blue lightning began to rage around Count Balarhard, and Adrian understood just how far beyond him his uncle truly was. This was a terrifying level of strength, the kind that let him pour out his full mana without hesitation, and every bit of it seemed aimed at crushing Adrian in the most humiliating way possible. A pulsing blue mana core ignited with overwhelming intensity, its power beating like a second heart. With a mana heart that fierce turned against him, Adrian could feel just how close this was to becoming a death sentence. Adrian's eyes widened as a strange chill ran through his thoughts. Something about this felt wrong, and the question rose in his mind before he could stop it. Wasn't this situation a little too strange? Count Balarhard's face remained locked in cold determination while blue energy swirled violently around his body, gathering and twisting like a storm waiting to break. Centuries ago, the world had once been filled with countless mana heart knights. They achieved feats that seemed almost impossible, their armor pulsing with raw power until a revolutionary method of mana manipulation appeared and changed everything. That technique allowed knights to release their power across incredible distances. In truth, the legendary knights of that era had all been mana heart knights, and their greatness had been built on that foundation. The so-called mana chain was not some greater path at all. Adrian believed it was only a clever trick, a way to stretch mana manipulation outward and control power from a distance. Hearing that, Adrian challenged the very idea being placed before him. His eyes narrowed as he demanded to know what Vale Balarhard was really trying to say about the mana heart. Vale Balarhard offered a completely different view. The mana heart itself had never been weak, he insisted. The failure belonged to the people who had used it poorly. He stood there with his sword gripped tight, weighing the truth of his own words. Adrian fixed his gaze on the older man, cutting straight through the tension as he waited for the real point behind all of this. Vale then revealed something far more important, asking whether Adrian had ever heard of a martial spirit hymn. He added that the very place where they stood was known as a place of crossed swords, a legendary battleground tied to warriors and their paths. Adrian, however, immediately brushed the subject aside as though it had nothing to do with the fight at hand. Adrian answered with a knowing smirk, as if he had already guessed where Vale was trying to lead the conversation. Vale continued anyway, explaining that once the mana heart had been conquered, those who used it were left in a lower position, almost like servants. Then he threw Adrian's own earlier words back at him, forcing the prince to face the contradiction. The amount of information came at Adrian all at once, heavy enough to make it feel almost overwhelming. When he was asked whether he needed a moment to breathe, Adrian rejected the offer immediately and made it clear he could take more. For a knight, the path itself mattered more than anything. Every step taken, every battle endured, and every mark left behind became the proof of who they were. The image shifted to a harsh battlefield buried beneath snow and wind, where a young knight stood with conviction blazing from his entire being. He declared that his 100 victories were the source of his greatest pride. He went even further, claiming those victories were not merely his pride, but his power as well. Vale Balorhard's eyes narrowed as he processed the meaning, a quiet sound escaping him under his breath. Then a blinding blue light erupted from the young knight, ethereal and fierce, marking the moment a martial spirit hymn was engraved directly into his being. The shimmering energy gathered around his outstretched hand, taking shape with undeniable force. With that surge of power, the martial spirit hymn was granted, settling into him as a new strength born from his own path. The newly awakened power flowed straight into the knight's sword, filling the blade until it hummed with energy from within. It was not some rare or exalted hymn, but a common-rank martial spirit hymn of sparring. Vale's eyes lit with sudden understanding. What looked grand and extraordinary was, in truth, only an ordinary and small achievement for someone who had not even earned knighthood yet. Then the vision reached its peak as the effect of the hymn of sparring activated. The vision intensified, revealing a young warrior with golden hair flowing around him. His eyes burned electric blue as raw power poured into the sword clutched in his hands. This was the true power of the mana heart. A martial spirit hymn had been unleashed, surging through the weapon with a force that refused to be stopped. A blinding blue aura suddenly exploded around Adrian, the hymn of sparring fully activating through him. But Count Balorhard only dismissed it with arrogance in his voice, claiming that all of it was pointless. He continued to taunt Adrian, rubbing in the claim that without a mana core, there was no way he could win this battle. But Adrian was no longer listening to the insults. He charged straight in, his sword flashing forward as a lightning-fast streak of blue power. Then the two weapons met. Steel crashed against steel in an explosive burst of sparks, the impact tearing through the battlefield between them. The ancient power of Gruhorn surged through Adrian, coursing through the powerful rings and overflowing from the core of his being. He forced himself through the pain, refusing to collapse as blue lightning erupted around him, and the raw power took hold of his body. Count Balorhard simply watched him struggle, a cold smirk slowly spreading across his face as though Adrian's effort only amused him. Their weapons clashed again, steel screaming against steel as sparks scattered around them. Through the noise, the Count's voice cut in, admitting that Adrian was quite good. Then he twisted the praise into mockery, saying Adrian was only good at stubbornly enduring. But Adrian's eyes burned brighter, and the blue energy around him flared even stronger in response. Adrian fired back with a voice that carried the weight of centuries. To obtain this hymn, he had spent more than 100 years. The mana held within the rings had been forged over 1,000 years, becoming a power meant to stand against the knights of the ring. Through countless climbs and repeated trials, that strength had been tempered again and again. Drawing on that ancient power, Adrian's sword ignited in blinding blue light. He unleashed the devastating 1,000 waves, sending a torrent of razor-sharp energy slashes tearing forward. With his eyes burning in fierce resolve, Adrian poured everything he had into the strike. This was the raw force of the hymn of sparring brought to life through his blade. Ground exploded beneath the sheer force of the attack. Count Balorhard, completely caught off guard, barely managed to utter a word before the blow connected. For the first time, it seemed as though the Count had been pushed just a little beyond what he expected. A crushing impact tore through the air, heavy enough to silence every trace of arrogance for a single breath. A fresh gash opened across Count Balorhard's face, shattering his confident grin into pure shock. Adrian's eyes burned with unyielding determination, his glowing blade still vibrating with the raw power he had just unleashed. Adrian launches forward with terrifying speed, carving the air apart in a blinding storm of strikes, each swing of his sword leaving behind a scorching trail of blue light. His golden eyes flare like they are burning from within, and with raw power surging through every muscle, Adrian drives the attack harder, pushing his assault right to the very edge. Count Balorhard is caught completely off guard. his expression tightening as he watches Adrian endure far beyond what should have been possible. Silently stunned that his opponent has lasted this long, the ancient sword screams in Adrian's grip, its edge alive with violent mana, crackling louder and brighter as if the weapon itself is about to burst. Then the blade lands with bone-rattling force, and the collision erupts outward in a brutal shockwave that tears through the space between them. The sheer force behind the strike drives Count Balarhard backward, shaking his stance so badly that his defenses look as though they might break apart at any moment. Adrian stands firm after the exchange, sword lifted and ready, his attack carrying both frightening precision and overwhelming strength as he prepares for whatever comes next. For the first time, open disbelief twists across Count Balarhard's face, his thoughts stumbling in confusion as he wonders how this could be happening, and whether his own judgment had been wrong. Emerald energy suddenly bursts from Count Balarhard's hand, and in that instant a cold understanding settles over him. Mana hearts are not all created equal. Still shaken from the heavy blow, he fixes Adrian with a hard glare as a dark aura rises around him, declaring that Adrian has become arrogant. But before that accusation can even fully settle in the air, Adrian answers with action, driving his foot down so violently that the ground beneath them fractures. Adrian surges forward through the shattered earth, wrapped in a brilliant blue glow, his sword sweeping up as raw energy snaps and arcs around the blade. Another thunderous collision shakes the battlefield, blasting dust, stone, and broken fragments outward in every direction. Adrian's blue aura bursts out even more fiercely as he declares that he is done playing around. Across from him, Count Balarhard remains upright in the swirling dust, calmly recognizing the renewed resolve in Adrian's stance, even calling that determination commendable. Looking up at Adrian with a glimmer of interest in his eyes, Count Balarhard says he will praise him. But then his expression grows heavier and more thoughtful, as he concludes that, just as expected, an ordinary grade martial spirit hymn is still not enough. Crushing force crashes down, and Adrian drops to one knee, his sword planted hard against the ground as the only thing keeping his battered body from falling completely. Even then, his eyes refuse to waver, burning with stubborn conviction as he says the knights made one terrible mistake. In a flash of ancient glory, a red-caped hero from a forgotten age appears, standing tall atop a mountain of fallen enemies like an unstoppable titan of the past. Those legendary knights had failed in one crucial way. They left no true strength behind for the generations that followed them. At the very beginning, everything had been inherited properly, passed down whole and untouched, with none of its original brilliance lost. The old legend unfolds further, showing the hero perfecting devastating sword techniques and mastering the deep martial spirit method used to temper and refine the heart. There had even been shining martial spirit hymns, radiant with power. But time is merciless, and little by little, it began to chew away at those once glorious achievements. The figure of the ancient hero, once blazing with triumph, now seems weighed down by forgotten history, until those incredible feats faded into nothing more than distant whispers, no different from stories of dragons no living person had ever seen. There had once been an age where colossal kings and monstrous beings walked the world, yet now even their existence has thinned into rumor, carried only by the faint winds of history. In that forgotten era, even the greatest martial spirit techniques eventually slipped into myth. Humanity, of course, survived by adapting, creating new martial spirit hymns in place of the lost ones. But compared to the ancient arts, their power was painfully limited. Back then, defeating 10 knights with one hymn was already considered extraordinary, and cutting down 100 soldiers stood as the absolute limit for a hymn made only to fight humans. Those newer martial spirits simply could not compare to the legends of old. They never rose to the level of myths or heroes, and in the face of even a basic holy strike, they were too weak to hold their ground. Adrian sits alone in a dark room, his gaze fixed on the glow spreading across the wooden table before him. As his thoughts race, the truth becomes impossible to ignore. With these incomplete, half-formed martial spirits, reaching true power is nothing more than a fantasy. From high above, Adrian Leonberg looks down with biting contempt and throws out a sharp challenge, asking whether the man below has been drinking dirt. He cannot even make sense of the nonsense being thrown at him, and with a flash of blue energy, he moves swiftly, almost dismissively. But the man standing against him is Vale Balarhard, and he shows no sign of retreat, his eyes blazing with stubborn defiance. Adrian's power erupts around him in a brilliant blue aura as he snarls at Vale Balarhard, calling him an arrogant and foolish knight. He stomps down with crushing force, his voice thick with contempt, and demands that Vale understand exactly how great a thing he has lost. Then something terrifying begins to take shape. A monstrous shadow swells around Adrian, pulsing with an infernal red glow until its dreadful form becomes clear, its eyes burning like twin points of crimson malice. Fully unleashed, the dark entity looms before Vale Balarhard, its voice echoing with a chilling promise to teach him a brutal lesson. A huge glowing hand reaches forward, making the threat feel even more inescapable. Dark crimson energy coils around Adrian's hand as the transformation ignites, radiating a force that no ordinary sword could ever hope to pierce. It is a power fierce enough to tear through even a dragon's scales. As Adrian rips a blade from its sheath, his entire body becomes a storm of shadow, red lightning, and violent pressure. A primal roar tears out from deep inside him, and his eyes blaze with infernal crimson fire as the transformation erupts with even greater force. That raw power detonates through his body and smashes into the earth beneath his feet, cracking the ground as the savage force inside him seems to howl for the blood of his enemies. Adrian understands that this monstrous strength comes from the ancient hymn of true dragon. But as his hand twists and his fingers sharpen into razor-like claws, the overwhelming might of the hymn begins threatening to rip his current body apart from within. A guttural cry of agony bursts from Adrian's throat, blood spraying from his mouth while chaotic crimson energy rages across him. At his chest, a strange blue light struggles desperately against the inferno, fighting to keep the power from consuming him completely. Yet one vital part of the hymn is still missing, leaving a hollow gap inside the ancient chant. Because of that missing piece, Adrian remains exposed, with the ultimate power of the dragon still just beyond his reach. Adrian's body convulses violently as the force of the hymn of true dragon explodes out of him in a savage crimson burst. The air itself seems to tear apart as the ancient incantation, the power that splits the dragon's scales, takes hold. His eyes burn a furious red, and a raw scream rips from his throat. He clenches both hands until his knuckles whiten, fighting desperately to contain the unstable power surging through him. Then, from within the darkness, a figure wrapped in heavy energy strikes. Their attack flashes like a blade of azure light, crashing violently against Adrian's raging crimson aura. The collision shatters the air around them, sending brilliant shards of blue energy bursting outward as the azure force begins to completely overwhelm the red. Adrian's eyes widen in genuine shock as the terrifying truth hits him. At this rate, the power will devour him from the inside out. The blue energy gathers and twists together, forming a radiant vortex that churns in the air, pulsing with wild, untamed power. Then, with a deafening roar, the two opposing forces slam into each other in a catastrophic explosion, ripping apart the ground beneath them. The clash blooms into a blinding golden-orange blast, as if the battlefield itself is being torn open. Adrian is thrown back by the force of the explosion, battered by the blast as a desperate cry of "Your Highness" cuts through the chaos around him. But through the smoke, dust, and broken rubble, the shadowy figure continues advancing, dark energy crackling around them with no sign of stopping. Adrian clutches his injured arm in pain, staring ahead in disbelief, forced to understand that the fight has already slipped completely out of his hands. Count Balarhard stands over the defeated prince, his presence cold and overwhelming, and delivers a cutting taunt, asking if Adrian had not said he would use only one ring. With his eyes glowing a cold blue, Count Balarhard presses the humiliation even deeper, pointing out that Adrian still failed despite using all 4 rings. Count Balarhard remains standing in victory, blue aura radiating from his body like proof of the overwhelming strength that had crushed Adrian's challenge. Looking down at the broken prince before him, Count Balarhard delivers the final insult with merciless calm, telling Adrian that he could not even save his own sword. Adrian lay there completely broken on the icy ground, his sword reduced to shattered pieces beside him, while Count Balarhard drove in the final merciless truth. This outcome had been decided from the very beginning. Crushed by defeat and unable to rise, Adrian could only stare up from the frozen battlefield as Count Vale Balarhard stood over him, making the brutal end of their battle impossible to deny. Those piercing electric blue eyes remained fixed on the fallen prince, cold and unrelenting, yet it was the scarred Count, crimson light burning in his gaze, who delivered the blow that cut deepest of